All right, everybody, what's up? Today, we are doing something really unique on the Lance Independent channel, which is I'm hosting a debate. This is my first time doing this, so we will see how it goes. Hopefully, it won't be a big disaster. I have a pretty good impression of our debaters that they're not going to, like, I don't know, interrupt each other and scream and yell and fight and make this into a big chaotic mess. So maybe they'll surprise me. Hopefully not. So I see people already getting riled up in the comments. That's great. But I want to get started by allowing our guests to introduce ourselves, but also, just to be clear, you probably saw from the title and everything that this is a debate over dualism. So it's a debate about metaphysics, about the fundamental nature of reality and what things are composed of. Are they physical? Are they non-physical? Is there both? So that's what it's all about. We were hoping to pull people in with the question about whether souls exist, which really is pretty closely connected to this question, but you might think it's a somewhat different question. In any case, I will allow the debaters to introduce themselves, but first I'll just let everybody know how we're going to be doing this. This is going to be more structured. I tend to do really unstructured stuff. So for me, it's a bit challenging. So we're going to have up to 15-minute openings, starting with David. Then we're going to go into 5-minute rebuttals. We're going to have a 1-hour open dialogue and then 5 minutes closing statements. After that, we will have a Q&A. So drop your questions in the chat. I'll do my best. I haven't done like a thing where I try to keep track of questions, but I'll try. And hopefully, because there wasn't a lot of notice, I got some of my moderators in here, so we'll try to keep things, relatively sane in the comments. So just keep it classy in there. Don't all scream and yell at each other and get really hostile. I know people could get worked up about this stuff. Okay, so we'll just get right into it. Why don't we, David, since you're going first, why don't you start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are, what you do, whatever it is you want to say about yourself, and then we'll switch over to you, Jed. David, take it away.
Well, sure. I'm not exactly a stranger to the channel because I'm the one and only Christian who's also sympathetic to moral anti-realism. And so Lance Bush, being the internet king of moral anti-realism, I've been on here a couple times with you before. But yeah, for those who don't know me, I am a Christian involved in Christian apologetics. My YouTube channel is called Faith Because of Reason. And looking forward to discussing one of my favorite topics tonight.
All right, thank you. And Jed, take it away.
Sure. So my name's Jed. Thanks so much, Lance, for having me on the channel. Dave and I have actually briefly discussed this topic before. We had a debate over on my channel about the resurrection of Jesus, but my channel is called the Flying Spaghetti Auditor. I do a lot of atheist, anti-religious, pro-skepticism content. We do deep dives into Bible contradictions, the pseudoscience of religion, immorality within theism and Christianity in particular, everything skepticism. So my whole goal on my channel is just promoting critical thinking and skepticism towards superstition and bad ideas. And the existence of a soul, I would certainly put into the category of superstitious. So I'm looking forward to dismantling this idea.
Excellent. All right. So, David, you are going to be up first, and I believe you do have a presentation for us. So if you want to get that ready, we'll get that up on the screen. And then what we'll do is as soon as you start talking, I'll start the timer. Sound good? And that doesn't count. Agreeing doesn't count as starting the timer. We good?
Yes, we're good.
All right. So, not quite ready?
Nope, we're good. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right, let's start.
And there's that little thing on the bottom that you might want to hide. All right,
Yep.
Awesome. All right, we are ready to go.
All right, so in today's debate, I will be defending the thesis of substance dualism, the thesis that the human person consists of two substances, a material body and an immaterial mind or soul. Let me just give some quick definitions to give the audience some idea of how I'm going to be using these terms. By the term substance, I refer to an essentially characterized particular, or in layman's terms, the characteristics that cannot be removed from something without thereby removing the thing itself. Both the notions of material or physical and immaterial or non-physical are notoriously difficult to define, but without getting into the weeds of how to resolve long-standing issues like Hempel's dilemma and the problem of individuation, for the purposes of this debate, it suffices to stipulate that physical or material entities are the sorts of things that are both extended in space and are publicly accessible, at least in principle, two multiple conscious agents at once. For example, a tree would be a physical object because multiple people can all see it at the same time. Conversely, a non-physical or immaterial thing is not extended in space, and it is metaphysically private in the sense that it is something that cannot be publicly accessed by multiple conscious agents, even in principle, but rather only by one particular agent. Now, there's a lot more to say here, but time precludes me from giving a full analysis of these terms. Consequently, these definitions will have to suffice. So now that we have some idea of what it means for the human person to be constituted by both a material and an immaterial substance, let's turn to consider the reasons why someone might think that this thesis is true. I will offer 3 arguments in support of substance dualism. First, let's consider my favorite argument for dualism, Descartes' modal argument. I would formalize it this way. 1, my mind is essentially either material or immaterial. 2, if it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, then my mind is not essentially material. 3, it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material. 4, therefore, my mind is not essentially material. 5, therefore, my mind is essentially immaterial. The first premise, I think, is a true dichotomy. One could, of course, try to suggest that the mind is comprised of both material and immaterial components, but I assume that a physicalist like Jed isn't going to want to accept this, since that effectively concedes the debate. So if that option is a non-starter, then I think that the physicalist should accept the first premise. The second premise is true by definition, and the last 2 premises follow deductively from the prior 3. Therefore, premise 3, asserting that it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, is going to be the contentious premise. So why think that it is true? Well, quite simply because conceivability is the best way to determine what is logically possible, and it is plainly conceivable that my mind should exist in the absence of all material things, as made readily evident by thought experiments involving Descartes' omnipotent malicious demon who could just be deceiving me about the existence of my body, or the Matrix, where the world we experience is just a big computer simulation, or body switching, where one mind is transferred to and experiences the world through another body. Additionally, out-of-body experiences seem perfectly conceivable, and metaphysical idealism, the idea that everything is actually mental, also seems conceivable. Remember, I am not arguing that any of these hypotheticals are actually real, or even that they are physically possible. I'm just saying that they do not contain any logical contradictions and are therefore logically possible. But now here's the thing. If the mind is essentially material, then none of these scenarios are actually logically possible. Yet they are readily conceivable. So to get around this, Jed will need to either show that all of these scenarios contain logical contradictions and so are not logically possible, or he will have to deny that conceivability is a reliable guide to possibility. And I am happy to argue that neither of these is a viable move for him. Thus, given that the third premise of the modal argument appears to be true, and I think that's really the only vulnerable premise, I think that we're justified in accepting the conclusion that the mind is essentially immaterial. All right, my second argument is based upon an indirect realist theory of perception. Now, indirect realism is the idea that the immediate objects of sensory impressions are mental representations of the physical objects beyond them. In other words, when I look at a tree, I am not directly seeing the tree, but rather a mental image that my mind has generated of the tree. Now, this position contrasts with direct realism, which holds that I actually see the tree itself. So now that we have some understanding of what indirect realism is, I'll show you how it leads to the truth of dualism. The argument looks like this. Premise 1, if indirect realism is true, then immaterial mental entities exist. 2, indirect realism is true. 3, therefore, immaterial mental entities exist. The first premise is true by definition, since the representations or mental images that indirect realism entails are in no way situated within the brain, or indeed anywhere else within the physical world. If they exist, then they would have to be immaterial. Obviously, the conclusion follows necessarily from the two premises, so the only really vulnerable premise is premise 2. Fortunately, the evidence in support of premise 2 is just overwhelming. Consider something as simple as the time lag between when events actually occur and when we see them. Ordinarily, of course, this time lag is very brief, consisting of only milliseconds, but it can be more pronounced in the case of, for example, seeing a star supernova. By the time we see a supernova, the event occurred thousands or even millions of years ago. So unless we are able to see into the past, which no longer exists, we are forced to conclude that we are experiencing a present effect or representation of something that no longer exists. And this entails that indirect realism is true. Consider also the phenomenon of double vision. If you take an object like a pencil and bring it right in front of your nose, the pencil will appear to divide in two. But since the pencil does not actually divide in this way, we must be perceiving two mental images of the pencil, neither of which is numerically identical to the pencil itself. Once again, this entails indirect realism. Then there is the phenomenon of illusions. Consider the Hermann grid illusion, where black spots seem to appear and disappear along a checkered background, even though no such spots are present in the physical stimulus. This presents an obvious case of the mind adding something that is not physically present to the experience. And indirect realism can easily explain this because it insists that the mind constructs mental images that represent physical reality rather than affording us a direct window into it. And this is to say nothing of dreams and hallucinations, which further demonstrate the capacity of the mind to create mental images that are not present in the physical world at all. All in all, I think that the case for indirect realism is fairly conclusive. But if so, then the conclusion of the argument follows irresistibly. The last argument that I wish to present is a version of the argument from introspection, which I like to call the argument from certainty. I formulate it as follows. Premise 1. For every physical state of affairs, knowledge of it is fallible. 2. But knowledge of at least some of my own mental states is not fallible. 3. Therefore, at least some of my own mental states are not physical states. The first premise is based on the observation that knowledge of physical states of affairs is based on sensory perception. And for the reasons already covered, we can never know infallibly that we are not dreaming or hallucinating or victims of the matrix. And so given this, I think that we are more than warranted in accepting the first premise as true. The second premise is more controversial. However, I think that it's easy to locate examples of mental states that are known infallibly. Suppose you are experiencing an intense migraine and you go to the hospital. Suppose that the doctor thoroughly examines you and can find nothing wrong and nothing physically that would indicate that you are in pain. No C fibers are firing. In this scenario, I think you would still know with certainty your own mental state of being in intense pain. But we can move beyond intuition. Without the ability to know some mental states infallibly, I think that global skepticism follows. Consider what it means to possess epistemic justification for a belief. This means that the belief is either certainly true or probably true. But if we reject that anything is known infallibly, then beliefs cannot be justified with certainty, so that only leaves you with probability. But probability is always relative to something else. There has to be something further to make the truth of a belief probable. And so unless you have an infallible stopping point, you either end up with an infinite regress of probabilities, or you end up with nothing, since without an infallible foundation, there is nothing from which probability can accrue. I take an infinite regress of justification to be untenable. Hence, I conclude that you have to be able to know something with certainty in order to know anything at all. But if something can be known with certainty, then the second premise of the argument from certainty is true, and the conclusion follows. Now, there are a bunch of arguments against dualism out there, and I'm sure that Jed and I will be discussing some of them. However, I want to preemptively address some of the most common one of the most common objections that I know that Jed is fond of using. This comes from examples of people like Phineas Gage, who experience some sort of brain trauma, and this radically alters their mental capabilities. The reason why this doesn't challenge dualism is because almost all dualists are interactionists. We believe that the mind and body causally interact with one another. And so while the mind can exert causal influence over the body, the reverse is also true. Damage to the body or brain can have a causal impact on the mind. What examples like Gage prove is that there is a detailed interplay between the functions of the body and the mind. What they do not prove is that the two are identical. I also want to preemptively flag two common problems that afflict arguments against dualism. The first is that they typically only apply to interactionist varieties of dualism. And while, as I've said, I am unabashedly an interactionist, strictly speaking, even if Jed managed to show that interactionist dualism was false, that would not suffice to show that physicalism is true, since other non-interactionist types of dualism could still be true. So as Jed presents arguments against dualism this evening, carefully consider if these objections, even if successful, actually rule out the full range of dualist theories of mind. The second problem is that arguments against dualism tend to equally afflict physicalism. I suspect that the issue of how the soul interacts with the body will be discussed this evening. But ask yourself if we actually have any clearer notion of how one material object interacts with another material object. This is but one example of how arguments against dualism tend to be reversible and equally afflict physicalism. So be on the lookout for these two problems with Jed's arguments against dualism. With that, it looks like I'm out of time. So I just want to close by thanking Jed for agreeing to the debate and to Lance for hosting, of course. I really like interacting with both of you. I'm looking forward to the remainder of this debate. And with that, I will shut up and I'll hand it over to Jed.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Definitely within the time. So, Jed, when you are ready, can I add your stuff to the stage?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. And okay, so I guess we will just continue on. You've got 15 minutes, and as soon as you get going, I will hit the timer.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Here we go. All right. Today, we are debating mind-body dualism, or more specifically, substance dualism, rather than just defending the null hypothesis by sitting back and just saying, I'm not convinced. I thought I would go ahead and accept a burden of proof of my own regarding the position of reductive physicalism. So reductive physicalism is basically the opposite of dualism. It's the position that all mental states, such as thoughts and feelings, are fundamentally physical states of the brain. It holds that mental properties can be reduced to or are identical with physical properties like neural processes and brain chemistry. And there is ultimately only one kind of property, the physical kind. This means that what we call mind is simply a description of physical processes occurring in the body. I have two main arguments which I would like to put forward as evidence in favor of my claim. One, everything we currently explain about minds is done exclusively by appealing to physical processes within the physical brain and body. And two, everything we can identify as a process or a quality of the mind can be affected by physically altering the physical body. So let's talk about argument number one. Everything we can currently explain about minds is done exclusively by appealing to physical processes within the brain and body. We know a lot about the brain. I'm no neuroscientist, but here's a brief summary. The brain is composed of gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is primarily responsible for processing and interpreting information, and white matter transmits information via electrical signals to other parts of the nervous system. The brain is comprised of three major sections: the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. The brainstem connects the cerebrum to the spinal cord. It includes 3 primary sections: the midbrain, which facilitates hearing, movement, coordination, and responses to environmental changes; the pons, which are the origin site of the 12 cranial nerves and enable tear production, chewing, blinking, focusing, vision, balance, hearing, and facial expressions; the medulla, the point at which the brain meets the spinal cord, necessary for heart rhythm, breathing, blood flow, oxygen and CO2 levels, sneezing, vomiting, coughing, and swallowing; the cerebellum, located at the back of the brain, controls voluntary movement, maintains posture, balance, and equilibrium. Some studies are exploring its role in addiction, autism, and schizophrenia. The biggest portion of the brain is the cerebrum, which is divided into 4 lobes, each with unique but interconnected roles. The frontal lobe is involved with personality characteristics, decision-making, movement, speech, and smell. The parietal lobe helps us identify objects, understand spatial relations, interpret pain, and understand language. The occipital lobe enables vision. The temporal lobe assists with short-term memory, speech, musical rhythm, and smell recognition. The cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres. The left controls the right side of the brain. The right controls the left. They are fused together by the corpus callosum. Some other noteworthy parts of the brain include the amygdala, which regulates emotion, memory, the brain's reward system, stress, and our fight or flight response; the hippocampus, which supports memory, learning, navigation, and perception of space. We could go on and on about parts of the brain and their function, but in summary, everything about who you are and what makes you you can be identified as a physical function of the brain. Let's talk about my second argument. Everything we can identify as a process or quality of the mind can be affected by physically altering the physical body. What might we recognize as processes or quality of mind? Well, perhaps character traits, personality, beliefs and values, memory, and the conscious experience. These are things we might expect to be carried over with us to, say, an afterlife, the fundamental parts of our mind that make us who we are and distinguish us from other people. And every single one of these things can be changed by manipulating the brain. Dave already mentioned this one, the most famous case. In 1848, Phineas Gage, a 25-year-old railroad foreman, survived having a 3-foot-long, 1.25-inch diameter metal rod shot through his skull and brain, removing a portion of his left frontal lobe. Before the accident, his colleagues regarded him as a kind, smart businessman, one of the best at his job. After the incident, his family and friends said he was no longer the same person. He lost his respect, kindness, was more profane, impulsive, got into more conflicts, and was difficult to get along with. He retained his memory and motor function, but his personality was radically altered. Here's another case. Henry Gustav Molaison, who in 1953 received a bilateral medial temporal lobotomy to surgically remove parts of his brain, which include, and I might butcher some of these parts of the brain, the front 2/3 of his hippocampus, his parahippocampal cortices, entorhinal cortices, piriformal cortices, and amygdala. The goal of the surgery was to help cure his epilepsy. Despite some success in subduing his seizures, Henry became unable to form new memories. Memories from before the surgery, like from when he was a kid, core memories, remained intact, but everything he experienced after the surgery was lost after about 30 seconds. Now, how do you think the epilepsy started in the first place? Was it a spiritual sensation? Maybe he was cursed by a demon? Oh no, surprise. It was brain trauma from a bicycle accident. In the 1960s, Dr. Joseph Bogan performed numerous surgeries where he split the corpus callosum, which gave us a lot of insight into split brain patients or people with a severed left and right hemisphere. While both halves of the brain usually remain fully functional, their communication between each other is lost. What sometimes seems like 2 minds in one body is actually explained by the functions of 2 parts of the brain failing to interact in a cohesive way. For example, When shown an image of a hammer to the left eye, patients are unable to verbally identify the object because the left eye is interpreted by the right hemisphere and speech is primarily controlled by the left hemisphere. A neurologist by the name of Ramachandran also studied split brain patients and included some individuals with different hemispheres who disagreed on the existence of God. And there were some of his patients whose one half of their brain was an atheist and the other half of the brain was a theist. And this poses all sorts of questions, like, does splitting the brain create two different minds? When a person dies, does one hemisphere go to heaven and the other hell? Doctors prescribe medication to alter the conscious experience of patients with depression, anxiety, bipolar, schizophrenia, and other cognitive conditions. Antidepressants increase neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine to improve mood and reduce anxiety. Antipsychotics block dopamine and serotonin receptors to prevent hallucinations. But you can also use recreational drugs to elicit hallucinations if you want to. DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, is among the most powerful hallucinogens. It's produced naturally by the brain and can be found in large amounts in plants like ayahuasca. Ingesting this chemical causes a global functional connectivity where the boundaries of normally segregated parts of the brain collapse. This results in a transformed state of consciousness with vivid hallucinations, altered sensory perception, and ego dissolution. Other substances like alcohol can impair judgment by disrupting brain communication in the frontal lobe, which controls decision-making, impulse control, and risk assessment. In conclusion, we have no reason to believe there is anything non-physical, supernatural, or other dimensional happening inside our heads. Everything that is understood about our brains is consistent with the claim that the mind is strictly a function of the physical brain. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Excellent. Excellent. So now we will move on to our rebuttal rounds. David, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Ready and rearing to go.
Okay. I will start the timer as soon as you get going.
Perfect. All right. Okay. So one interesting thing about the position that he laid out there is reductive physicalism, which I guess he defined as the position that the mind has only physical properties, is that he never actually defined what he meant by a physical property. And it'd be nice to have some idea about this, because a lot of times in my interactions with physicalists on this, it turns out that what they mean by physical is just kind of like anything that exists. So that, like, even if souls existed, then they would, like, by default be physical things, because physical just kind of becomes this empty catch-all term for whatever it is that exists. So I guess a little bit of an analysis of what exactly he means by physical would have been nice, but no matter. I'm curious, in the first argument he gave, and I had a little bit of a difficult time following it, but I'm curious who the we is supposed to be there in the, is we only refer to physical properties when referring to the mind? I'm not sure who we is supposed to be there. Presumably the dualist doesn't, and if you claim that they are, then that seems to be a question-begging argument. Of course, I could be missing something there, but that was my initial thought as he was laying that out. Similarly, he says everything that makes you can be found in the brain. What's the argument for this, right? He presented, he spent a lot of time going through, different parts of the brain and saying that, these parts are associated with these particular behaviors and things like that. That does not actually establish, though, that everything that makes you can be found in the brain, right? It just establishes that various parts of your personality and behavior are associated with activity in certain parts of your brain. I don't think any dualist is going to deny that, though. So that conclusion seems perfectly compatible with substance dualism to me, and so therefore would not indicate reductive physicalism over and against it. Let's see. He made some comments about the afterlife. Something I would like to flag here is that you can actually be a substance dualist without believing in an afterlife. Notably, I mean, there are dualists like Richard Fumerton, for example, who is, I believe he's an atheist. He's at least an agnostic. He doesn't believe in any afterlife as far as I know, and yet he wrote, one of the best books in defense of, well, he wrote his book defending property dualism, although he has since become a substance dualist from what I understand. But in any case, the point is you don't actually have to take on any religious ideas or any belief in an afterlife in order to be a substance dualist. Just a fun factoid there. The second argument, I think I kind of anticipated this one in my opening statement, but the key point to hit home is that almost all dualists believe that the mind and body interact, and it's not one-way interaction, it's two-way interaction. So it's not just the mind affecting the body, things that happen to the body also affect the mind. He brought up the issue of alcohol, right, affecting your mind. We agree with that as dualists, right? We don't think that the mind is completely detached from what happens in the physical world. We do believe that the mind can be affected by the body, and again, vice versa. The best that I think his argument the most that could be said for it is that it might put pressure on us to accept some form of emergent dualism, like William Hasker, for example, has defended in his book, The Emergent Self. If you think that, the tight sort of interplay between body and mind, if that moves you to sort of see that the mind is sort of the cause, or the brain rather, is the causal basis for the mind, well, unless we don't have any good reasons to be a dualist, and of course we'll have to see what he has to say about my arguments for dualism in his rebuttal. But it would seem to me at most this would just put us to say, okay, we've got good arguments for an immaterial mind, and we've got good arguments that the mind is dependent in some way on the brain. Emergent dualism is the perfect solution there for you. So you can absolutely believe in a physical basis for an immaterial mind. At best, I think that's what his second argument would get you to. As for split brain patients, my understanding is that they actually display a remarkable degree of unity in most respects. There are those weird, experiments with vision and things, but the sort of handicaps have been highlighted, I think, at the sort of expense of the unity, which is the really interesting conclusion. Since I'm running out of time, I'll just say for more on split brain experiments, I would refer people to a book called The Immortal Mind by Michael Egnor. He's a neurosurgeon who's actually done split brain experiments and is himself a substance dualist and discusses that in the first chapter of the book.
All right. Thank you very much. And that's time. So we'll turn it over to you, Jed. And as soon as you get started, I will start the timer, 5 minutes.
All right. So, yeah, I should have defined terms. That's something I can start with when we get into the open dialogue. But regarding Dave's opening statement and his three arguments, he mentioned at the start the material cannot be removed from something. I was a little confused on that, so I want to get some more clarification on what he's talking about later. The modal argument is basically that if it's not logically impossible, therefore it is the case. But it seems like this argument could be applied to literally any claim that's not logically impossible. So it's logically possible for God to not exist. Therefore, God does not exist. So it seems like that argument doesn't really work, because just because something's logically possible doesn't mean it's the case. And you could also flip the argument the other way in opposition to dualism. You could say, if it's logically possible for my mind to exist contingent on the physical, then my mind is not essentially material. As for a second argument from indirect realism, mental pictures are mental replications. I definitely agree with that. They're not actual, the physical reality around us. Now, he said that they exist. Your mental pictures of the universe exist. I want him to define exist, because they exist as a brain state, but that's it. So people with schizophrenia, for example, see entities which don't actually exist in our reality. But does that mean people with schizophrenia are tuned into some more real reality than our own? And do these hallucinations of theirs actually exist? Most of us would probably say no. He mentioned the time lag, that light takes time to travel and reach our eyes. I'm not sure what that has to do with dualism. Double vision is caused by the fact that we have two eyes and our brain is combining two different sensory inputs into one image. The brain's description or depiction rather of reality is not 100% accurate representation of the physical world. His last argument from certainty is mental state knowledge is infallible. So pain is caused by the brain, and usually the brain causes pain based on an injury or damage to the body. But sometimes pain occurs without damage, and sometimes damage occurs without pain. But the pain itself is a physical, not only sensation, but it has a physical manifestation in reality. It's based on pain receptors that are in our brain. And so even though it may be really hard to detect them because they're so small, there is something physical going on, even if there's no damage to the body. Whether someone's actually being damaged is irrelevant to the fact that they're experiencing pain. And a great example of this would be EHS, or electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which is people who experience pain when their body is exposed to high amounts of electricity. Anyone who's seen Better Call Saul is very familiar with this particular cognitive issue, where they experience physical pain based on a perception that doesn't actually have any effect on their body whatsoever. And that's pretty much all I have as far as rebuttal. I'll see the rest of my time and we can jump into discussion.
All right, excellent. So let's get things set for 1 hour and we will get started. Give me one moment. All right, so we are all set. We will move into open dialogue and I'll leave it to y'all to figure out how you want to navigate that.
All right. Well, Jed, maybe it'd be helpful if we begin by seeing if we can sort of settle on the issue of definitions, just so we're not talking past one another. Are you okay with the definition that I gave for physical in my opening statement, where I basically defined it as, and I'm not saying this is all there is to it, but just a couple of conditions would be it's extended in space and it can, at least in principle, be experienced by multiple conscious agents at once?
Yeah, I'm fine with that definition, although something physical could potentially be experienced by one person or by 0 people as well. Generally, I define physical as not necessarily anything that exists, because you're right, that kind of precludes the idea that, you know, if a soul exists, then it is physical. But I would say the physical is anything that can be measured in reality and that takes up space or has some sort of influence. Well, not necessarily has an influence in reality, but it exists in reality in some sort of detectable way.
Well, that was why I said in principle, was because obviously only one person or no people could be experiencing something physical. The in principle part is to say it's not the sort of thing that's like metaphysically private in the sense that I'm saying immaterial. At least immaterial mental entities might be. But okay, if that's a workable definition, then I think we could move on. Are you okay with starting with the modal argument?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Is it helpful for you if I have that up on the screen?
Yeah, that'd be fine with me. Yeah,
okay,
so this was
Lance,
the one.
Is that all right if I could just get it up there so that we can kind
Yep.
of maybe discuss it? All right. Then let me screen share one more time, because I know these arguments sometimes get long and can be hard to follow. So if I...
Let me know when you're ready.
Ready,
Freddy.
All right. So the criticism that you gave of this argument, as I understood it, was essentially, if I'm saying that something is not contradictory, right? If it's possible, then it's actual. That's not the argument, right? At no point is that a premise in the argument. It's if something is possible, then it's possible, right? If something, it doesn't have a logical contradiction, it is by definition logically possible. At no point does the argument here depend on the thesis that anything that is logically possible is therefore actual.
Now, I think I agree with the first premise, and I might have to have you clarify the second premise. When you say if it's logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material, then my mind is not essentially material. What do you mean by essentially material?
Yeah, so I just basically mean that the thing that you couldn't essentially, the thing that you couldn't take away from it, right, and still have it be the same thing. So the mind can't, for example, so let's say we have two possible worlds side by side, right? One where there's only immaterial things in it, and one where there's only material things in there. Well, if my mind exists in one of those worlds, it cannot exist in the other world, right? So if something is a physical object, it's essentially a physical object. If something is an immaterial object, it's essentially. So in other words, if I am a soul in the actual world, I couldn't exist in a world that is purely physical objects, right? Because a soul, by definition, is not a material object. So I'm basically just trying to rule out the idea that you could say, well, maybe it could be the same thing, but it could be physical in one world and non-physical in the other.
I think I might have an issue with the idea that that it's even logically possible for a mind to exist without anything material, because it's like saying, could a function of a brain exist without a brain? And to me, that just doesn't make any sense, because my understanding of mind is that it's a function of a brain. So if we don't have the brain, then there can't be a function of something that doesn't exist.
Okay, so are you just defining a mind as the function of a brain?
Well, that's one route we could go down, and that's how I would generally define mind, but that sort of begs the question. So then
Right.
the other route we could go down is that just because it's like I can conceive of a mind existing without a body, like I can imagine what it might be like for a soul to float around without a physical body, does that mean that it is possible or is the case? And it seems like that's where I might be missing the connection in the argument.
Okay, fair enough. Maybe let me begin then with the sorry, what was the first thing that you said there?
Just because I can conceive of a mind existing without a body doesn't mean that it's actually the case. And
no, you said something. You said something before that, though. But now I'm drawing a blank. But
well, I mentioned how I would be begging the question if I just
Right,
defined
okay.
a mind as a function of the brain.
Yes. Okay. So I was going to say, maybe if we could settle on a non-question begging definition then of what a mind is, could we just settle on that it's the thing that has thoughts and undergoes experiences? That way we don't beg any questions as to, whether it's a brain function or whether it is an immaterial soul or anything like that.
This seems like a fine working definition for now. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So then what I'm just saying is that the thing that has thoughts and undergoes experiences, that thing can exist in the absence of, or it's logically possible for that thing to exist in the absence of any physical things. And to motivate that, I basically appeal to something like it's possible that we exist in the Matrix, right? Or it's possible that we're victims of Descartes' evil demon, something like that. So these are the primary sort of motivations for accepting that you could have the same thoughts and the same experiences that you actually have, and they could be detached from absolutely anything physical.
Yeah, I'm not aware that a mind without a body is logically impossible. So I think I might be willing to grant that. Sure. I can't I like I said, we could conceive of a mind existing without a body, but I don't see how that gets us to therefore minds exist without bodies.
Well, so it gets you to that it's possible that minds exist without bodies.
Well, just because we can conceive of something, that might mean it's logically possible, but that doesn't mean it's actually possible. And I think
Okay.
you alluded to that earlier.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the distinction there's supposed to be between logically possible and actually possible. I mean, to be logically possible is to be actually possible.
I can conceive of all sorts of things. I could conceive of a pig with wings that farts rainbows, but that doesn't mean it's actually possible.
It is logically possible. There's
Exactly. It's logically
logical
possible, but that doesn't, just because it's logically possible doesn't mean it's actually possible or that it's the case. Or
Sure.
a better example might be, I could conceive of my body defying gravity and just starting to float and fly on its own like Superman, but that doesn't mean it's actually possible.
Well, it's not physically possible. It is logically possible, though, right? So are you familiar with the term modal scope?
Refresh my memory.
Okay, so modal scopes there's various types of possibility, right? So maybe to give a classic illustration here, to say it's possible I could jump to the moon, right? It's not physically possible. In other words, given the current laws of physics, I cannot jump to the moon. So in that modal scope of physical possibility, it's not possible for me to jump to the moon. However, it is logically possible, right, that I could jump to the moon. There's no logical contradiction entailed by that. So in the modal scope of logical possibility, which is the scope I'm adopting for my modal argument, that would be the relevant criterion to say it's not possible in that sense. It would have to be logically contradictory in some way.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. And I'd be happy to concede that a mind without a body is logically possible. But again, that doesn't mean that it's physically possible.
Sure. I don't, my argument doesn't depend on it being physically possible. So just to be clear then, so are you accepting then the third premise of my argument, that it is logically possible for my mind to exist apart from anything material existing?
I'm not aware of any logical contradictions involved with a mind existing without a body. So sure, I'm happy to accept that it's logically possible for a mind to exist without a body. But again, that doesn't get us anywhere close to if it's actually the case or if it's physically possible.
Well, it does, given, I mean, I can bring up the argument again, but I mean, at that point, it seems like you've granted every major premise of the argument.
And maybe I'm just missing part of the argument, because
Yeah,
I don't see how we get to
I'll
logically
try.
possible, therefore is the case.
Yeah, well, and that's, I think it's because the first premise is doing some work there, which you had granted, but if you want to go back and challenge that premise, that is fine as well. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull it up here. So, I mean, there's the argument again. If you grant the first premise that the mind is essentially either material or immaterial, then if you grant that it's logically possible for it to exist in the absence of all material things, it cannot be essentially material. That would be the point. If it's essentially one or the other, and one of these is possible, then the other is not possible. That's the basic argument. So it's not saying possible, therefore actual. It's saying because it can only be one or the other, it can only logically possibly be one or the other. If one is possible, the other is by default logically impossible. That's the essence of the argument.
Now, if we defined mind as a conscious experience that's capable of thinking, when we talk about a conscious experience, that relies on the parts of the brains in order to fabricate that experience. So if I lose everything in my brain, if I no longer have a brain, then how can a conscious experience even happen?
Are you talking about like in the actual, world?
I guess I'm not, I might not even be sure that it's logically possible for a mind to exist absent any physical. I mean, of course, I'm not convinced that's the case, because that's my whole position, but I just don't see how the argument gets you to therefore it's the case, or that it's even an argument for it's the case, because it seems like you're just saying because it's logically possible, therefore it's true.
Are you suggesting the argument's logically invalid?
Well, what's the conclusion of the argument?
Is therefore my mind is essentially immaterial.
And by essentially immaterial, you mean that it is immaterial?
Well, I mean, in the conclusion, yes. In the first premise, I'm saying it has to be one or the other, right? It can't, in one, like the same mind can't exist in a world that only has physical stuff in it, and then also in another mind that only has immaterial stuff in it. It can't be the same mind in both of those worlds, because if it's in one world, it has to be physical, and if it's in the other, it has to be non-physical.
I might have to go back and challenge the first premise too, because to say it's either physical or non-physical or material or immaterial seems to contradict how you're okay with the idea that our brains have a huge impact on our conscious experience. And so everything that I experience is affected at least by the physical world in my brain. So it seems like your position, at least from my understanding, is that the material and immaterial are interconnected with each other, and the conscious experience is not either one, but it's sort of a combination of the two.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, that is the case, that the two interact. But in the context of the modal argument, I don't think that actually matters, because we're just talking about what's possible. And presumably we would agree that it's, at least possible that we're being deceived by Descartes' evil demon, right? We don't know for 100% sure that there even is a physical world. So it does seem possible. And I mean, we can move on from this argument if you want to give it more.
Sure. Well, and the last thing I would pose, and I mentioned this in the rebuttal, is if we reverse the argument, what are your thoughts if I were to say it's logically possible for my mind to be contingent on the physical or essentially physical, and therefore my mind is not essentially immaterial, that it's essentially material?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. So the first one is, in order for the reverse modal argument to sort of be on par with my modal argument, there have to be equally good reasons for accepting the modal premise in both cases, right? So in my argument, that would be it's logically possible for my mind to exist in the absence of material things. In your argument, it would be it's logically possible for my mind to exist in the absence of immaterial things. So there have to be equally good reasons for accepting both of those premises. In mine, it's all of the various thought experiments that I think show that it's clearly conceivable that my mind can exist in the absence of any immaterial things. I've never actually seen a thought experiment from a non-actual possibility where my mind is a material thing. So that's kind of a standing challenge I have for physicalists. The other thing I would say is that I think that actually it does entail a contradiction if you accept that conceivability is the guide to logical possibility, because we seem to agree that you can conceive of our mind existing in the absence of all physical things. But now, if we say that we are, by hypothesis, an essentially physical being, and if we can't conceive of an essentially physical being conceiving of themselves as an immaterial being, right? The same being can't do both of those things at the same time. That would be a contradiction.
Well, so, I can conceive of myself existing exclusively materially. So I don't need
conceiving of in that case.
Like I can conceive of myself being a material agent, and I'm conceiving of being immaterial at the same time. I don't see how that's contradictory.
But remember, it's saying you're essentially one or the other, right? So it's saying you can't conceive of an essentially material being. Like, just leave yourself out of it for a second. Take a being that, like, we imagine it's material, right? There's nothing immaterial there. Now say that this being is conceiving of himself as immaterial. Now, can you conceive what that looks like from his perspective? In other words, you're imagining a purely material being, and now you're trying to imagine that being imagining himself as an immaterial being. You have to imagine him as effectively both material and immaterial, and as the same thing.
I'm not only imagining that, I feel like I'm experiencing it right now. I'm observing you, who's a essentially material being, conceiving of being an immaterial being. So that not only is it possible to conceive of it, I'm directly experiencing that exact phenomenon right now with you.
Well, that begs the question of the debate, though, because that assumes that I am a essentially material being.
Well, the same question begging is used in one of the premises of the argument, where you're saying I can conceive of myself being essentially immaterial, therefore I am essentially immaterial.
How is that question begging?
In the same way that mine is.
Mine's not question begging. I'm giving thought experiments to back mine up. To motivate your thought experiment, you have to start with the premise that the position I'm taking in the debate is false.
I don't see how there's anything contradictory with me perceiving or imagining a being who is strictly physical and material.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. The issue arises when you have to say you also have to conceive of that same being as being immaterial. You have to conceive of a being that has to, like, that's necessarily a physical being. You also have to conceive of it as an immaterial being.
Oh, I see. I think I might see the problem. So when I'm conceiving of a being, say you, who's conceiving of himself being an immaterial being, the conception that being has, and we'll use you as just an example, that conception is strictly physical, because all you're doing is creating a brain state of yourself as an immaterial being. But that brain state is ultimately physical. So I'm just conceiving of an entity who's strictly physical, and they are creating their own brain state through their imagination, which is also physical because it relies on the brain to create mental pictures. So everything in my scenario is physical. You're not, the person I'm conceiving of is not material and immaterial at the same time. They're material, but they're imagining themselves as immaterial using their physical imagination.
Right, but what I'm saying though is that what you saying that they are imagining, that has to still be them, right? They have to be being conceived of as both material and immaterial, and we've stipulated that the person is essentially material, which you cannot conceive of an immaterial entity that is identical to an essentially material being. That would essentially be the contradiction. But I mean, I don't want to get hung up here. If you want to move on, I'll give you the last.
Here's one more brain buster. Can you conceive of a being who is material? Wait, sorry, I messed it up. Can you conceive of a being who is immaterial, but they think that they're material?
I can conceive of them having the thought that they are. I can't conceive of them conceiving of that like from their own perspective. So it's one thing to like actually just be holding the belief that, oh yeah, I mean, I'm material or I'm immaterial. I could conceive of them having the belief and its faults. I can't conceive of them actually conceiving of that from their own perspective, because remember, my conception of this person is that they are essentially material or immaterial. So I can't simultaneously conceive of them as conceiving of something that they're not.
So what I asked you to do was basically what you asked me to do, but in reverse. So I don't see how if it's perfectly consistent for you to imagine an immaterial being who just thinks that they're immaterial, then similarly, I can imagine a being who is material, but just thinks that they're immaterial.
Sure, that would be different than conceiving it. In other words, I'm saying there's a difference between thinking something is true and actually like imagining the scenario where that's true.
I don't understand the distinction. What's the difference between imagining something is true and thinking something is true, or conceiving of something is true?
Yeah, one is just like assenting to the truth of the proposition, right, without actually like having any well thought out conception of what that proposition would actually have to be like if it were true. The other would be, so maybe here's an example you might be able to relate to. A lot of Christians, right, will claim to believe in the Trinity. A lot of them have absolutely no idea, right, about like what it actually would mean for one being to exist as three persons. So like, they believe it, but they aren't conceiving of it. They're not imagining it. So I'm saying there's essentially a difference between assenting to the truth of a proposition and actually conceiving of the scenario where the proposition is true. Does that make sense?
No.
Okay.
It seems like with the Trinity example, I mean, that's something I would argue is completely contradictory, and that's a topic for another debate. But someone could say they believe in the Trinity and they haven't thought it through very well, and someone could say they believe in the Trinity and they have thought through it more than the last person, but they still don't realize that it's a contradictory position, or they just deny that it's a contradictory position.
I don't think that the point I'm making though is that there can be a distinction between just believing a proposition and then actually imagining the instantiation of the truth conditions for the proposition. That was all I was using the Trinity analogy to illustrate.
Sure. Yeah, we can move on to your second line of argument if that's cool with you.
Yeah.
The argument from realism, and this was the one where mental pictures are replications of the world around us.
Correct. You want me to put that one up as well?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mentioned before, I agree with the idea that our mental states of the universe are just that. They're mental states. They're replications our brain make based on our sensory input. So if we did not have eyes, noses, ears, Golgi tendon organs, and nerve endings on our hands and the rest of our body, we would be unable to form a mental picture of the world around us. So our mental picture relies on our physical sensory organs in our brain in order to be created. And so if we lacked these sensory organs, we would have no way of identifying anything about the world around us. So the idea that a mind could exist without a body, what kind of existence would that even be? They'd have no perception of anything around them whatsoever.
So what I'm hearing is you accept the second premise of this argument, right? You're accepting indirect realism?
Can you define indirect realism?
It'd be the idea that we perceive the physical world indirectly by way of mental representations or images.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah,
Okay,
I
so
agree
you are
with that.
accepting the second premise. So
Yes.
then your dispute is with the first premise. You don't think that immaterial mental entities exist if indirect realism is true?
Yeah. So, like in the example I gave with someone with schizophrenia, they are perceiving a mental entity who doesn't actually exist.
I don't see how that would. Why would that affect the first premise?
Can you define, and maybe it doesn't, can you define the word exist within the first premise?
I mean, I don't know if so. It's actually incredibly difficult to like define what we mean by existence, but I just mean that it has some sort of ontological status. That it is, and I think I know what you're getting at. But I'm saying it has the same sort of status. Well, let's just say it has the same sort of status as any sort of physical entity, right? So a house or a tree or you and me. I mean that it has the same sort of ontological status as those things.
I think I would disagree with the first premise in a sense where that they exist as a real entity within the universe. So these immaterial mental entities, like when I look at you on my screen, I'm not actually. I mean, the screen that I think I'm seeing is just my brain recreating a picture of the screen that my eyes take in. So to say that you actually, well, maybe you're a bad example, but let's say I have a mental image of God in my head. Does that mean God actually exists?
No,
it seems like that's sort of
the mental image does exist in your mind.
The mental image exists as a brain state. So existence in the sense that it's a pathway of neurons that's forming a certain mental image, but that's it. It's a pathway of neurons.
Okay, so where is this image then in the brain?
Well, it doesn't really exist in a place per se, but it's a visual representation that my what is it? The occipital lobe creates based on what my eyes take in. So they're creating an image, a mental image that my brain is interpreting as the world around me.
Okay, but are you saying that the image is actually like in your brain, like we could do surgery and find it in there, or this is just something that is being created by your brain, but only you have access to it?
Closer to the second one. Yeah, if you spliced open my brain, you wouldn't find what my eyes see. Maybe someday we'll have technology where we can tune into somebody's brain and see what they're perceiving. But as of now, my mental image of the world is exclusively mine. So like in the example of someone with schizophrenia, we have absolutely no way of seeing what they see.
So this seems to concede the premise then. Remember, the definition that I offered of immaterial entities was that they are not extended in space and that they are metaphysically private in the sense that only one agent can access them. I mean, I guess you can hold out promissory notes of like maybe one day science will make it such that like, hey, maybe we can actually get access to these things. But as of right now, certainly seems to be the case that you cannot find these mental images anywhere in the brain.
Yeah, it seems like this argument on a fundamental level is kind of similar to the first one, where say if I see a picture of a pink unicorn, does that mean pink unicorns actually exist? Well, no, the picture that I'm looking at, you could say exists, but my mental state is just my brain's way of replicating something that I can interpret as a visualization. So I wouldn't say that these visual interpretations my brain makes exist in some sort of way that they don't exist in space, right? Are they immaterial? Not really, because if we get down to it, what we're actually talking about is pathways of electricity in my brain, which can be measured and directly observed. So if I see, you hook me up to a brain scanner and you show me a picture, you can see different pathways within my brain, when the electricity moves around, or different parts of the brain light up with more electricity than others. And that's the physical representation of what I'm actually seeing. That's to whatever extent these visual images exist, that's it.
Well, that could be the cause of them, right? But the images are clearly different than, just the energy, right, or whatever moving around in the brain, right? You can't look at the energy and thereby see the content of your visual field. So the content of your visual field is different than the activity in your brain, even if it could be caused by the activity in your brain. I'm fine with that, but I'm just saying I think it's transparently obvious that the image itself is different than that neurochemical activity.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Sure.
But then that seems to yield the conclusion then that there are immaterial mental entities.
I wouldn't say that there's mental entities. I would say there's first person perceptions of a visual interpretation of the world around us.
Either way, whatever term you want to use, whether you want to call it an entity, a representation, image, it seems like the criteria of being immaterial is met. It's not something that's extended in space, and it is something that's metaphysically private, which, remember, was the definition of immaterial.
So does this prove that a mind is immaterial? I think it might prove that our vision is the visual representations we have of the universe are immaterial in the sense that the images themselves are visible to us only, and they're necessarily first person, but that doesn't mean that my conscious experience exists outside of my brain, because ultimately the brain is responsible for taking in sensory information and creating this visual representation. So in whatever space or to whatever extent that these visualizations exist, they're exclusively within my brain and a function of my brain.
Well, they're not identical to the function, but I mean, I'll grant you this. It's not, this argument won't be enough to get you to like full-blown Cartesian dualism, but it does seem that if you're granting that these things are not extended in space and that they are metaphysically private, then we at least have some sort of like property dualism or some sort of emergent dualism going on here, that we're not going full-blown reductive physicalist.
It seems like you might be conflating mind, which we defined as like conscious experience, with sight and visual representation of the world around us. So my sight is separate from my mind. My mind is a function of my brain, and I would argue the sight is also a function of the brain, because I can't see things unless I have a physical brain. So to whatever extent that these visual representations exist, they still rely on my brain and my sensory organs, my eyes, in order to form.
Sure, but remember, dualism is compatible with that, right? We can go emergent dualist and say that in order to have these sort of immaterial conscious experiences, certain stuff in the brain has to be happening, right? So in that sense, that's not contradicting dualism. That's just pushing you towards some type of dualism like emergent dualism.
Yeah, I'm not sure how it pushes towards dualism, because no matter what, the brain is necessarily involved with the process, and you can't separate your visual experience from your brain.
Yeah, I think that emergent dualism would be a way where it's compatible with that, where you can't have the conscious activity without the brain, but the conscious activity nevertheless remains an immaterial thing.
This kind of brings up another question I had for you. In your rebuttal, you mentioned, like, I made the claim, what makes you is exclusively found in the brain. Things like memories, personality. We can add your visual experience to the list. What is it, if anything, that you think makes me that is not found or a function of the brain?
Well, I mean, I'm going to say it's your mind, right? The things I think that you're highlighting are the physical sort of correlates of conscious experience, right? But I'm going to deny the inference from correlations between these two and them therefore being identical. It seems to me that there's an inference between you have this stuff correlated with these aspects of conscious experience, therefore they're identical. And that's where I'm denying the inference.
So the parts of the brain that we might identify as me, like personality, character traits, values, beliefs, memories, these are all pieces that I would say added up equal what we're usually talking about when we say the word mind. And you seem to admit all of these pieces on their own are physical, but when added together, now they're immaterial. Where am I wrong?
I do not admit that those things are physical on their own. What I admit is that they are correlated with, or that they have physical correlates, but I don't think that the things themselves are physical. They're not identical to those physical correlates.
I don't see how there's any demonstration that they're anything other than physical. So everything about me, my memories and personality, they can be manipulated by altering my brain. We can see what parts of the brain are responsible for these particular characteristics and functions. So it seems like all the available evidence points to the idea that every single thing that we can identify as a part of the mind is a function of the physical brain.
What you're actually pointing to there is that you can manipulate mental stuff by manipulating physical stuff, right? So I'm an interactionist, right? I believe that mind and brain interact. So obviously, I think that the mind can make changes to the brain and vice versa. So it's not surprising on my hypothesis that you could mess with stuff in the brain and that would have repercussions for our conscious experience. What I'm denying is that you can say, because there's correlation between the two, therefore they are identical to one another.
I think where we might be talking past each other is that we're both looking at evidence and saying this evidence is consistent with my perspective, and that's it. And so there's it seems like in both of our cases, whatever you bring up, I can say, well, that's also consistent with my view, where the mind is a function of the brain. And then whatever I say, we can manipulate anything, any part of our mind by manipulating the physical brain. You can say, well, that's consistent with my view. So is there any evidence you can think of that's not consistent with reductive physicalism?
Yeah, and I mean, broadly, the three things that I brought up in my opening statement, I don't think that the indirect realist theory of perception is compatible with physicalism because it commits us to the existence of mental images that cannot be identified with any objects in the physical world. I think that certain modal facts about ourselves, like that we could exist in the absence of physical things, I don't think that that's compatible with reductive physicalism. And I think that the fact that we can have certainty about epistemic certainty about certain propositions, I think that that's also incompatible with reductive physicalism, because knowledge of any physical thing is going to be fallible because it has to be based on sense perception.
Yeah, that's a good segue into your third point. Yeah, the argument from certainty. So my understanding of pain is that pain is based on receptors in our brain causing us to experience pain. Sometimes there's receptor blockers that prevent us from feeling pain, like when we're in a sports performance and you get you get some injury, you break your ankle, but you don't realize it until after the performance is over. And then you're like, oh, holy cow, what did I do to myself? And this is because the body produces adrenaline and other chemicals that help to block pain until you get into a situation where now your body is at a better time to deal with the pain, because your brain prioritizes certain activities over others. Or like if you're running from a bear with a broken ankle, your body is going to suppress the pain of the ankle until you reach safety, and then it's going to kick in. So pain, from my understanding, is also strictly physical, and it can be traced back to the brain, and it's a function of the brain.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure what that has to do, and I say this with all due respect, I'm not sure what that has to do with the argument, right? The argument is that premise one would be knowledge of any physical state is fallible. The second premise would be knowledge of at least some of my own mental states is infallible. And that, of course, just generates the conclusion that at least some of my own mental states are not physical states. And sorry, I know we have less than 30 minutes left. So I do want to give you a chance to press me on some of your arguments if you'd like to do that. So I'm not, hogging the entire the whole time here. But strictly speaking, I just gave the pain example. That was to give an illustration of something that I think you can have certainty about, is when you're in. Basically that was just a example to motivate the second premise of the argument.
Yeah. And I think that when we say my knowledge of X is infallible, I mean, if you think you're experiencing pain, what if you're actually a brain in a matrix? And so you think you're experiencing pain, but your pain receptors in your fake body are actually all fake. And then your real mind, which is off somewhere else, is not experiencing any pain. I mean, is the pain itself not real? Because I guess maybe I'm not even understanding the argument. Because you have infallible knowledge that you're experiencing pain because it's first person, that means therefore what?
Well, so that would be to justify the second premise, which is that I can have infallible knowledge of some things. Remember, the first premise says that knowledge of any physical thing is fallible. So I'm saying you can't have certainty about anything physical in the first premise. The second premise is saying, but there's some things that I can have certainty about, and so the conclusion is that therefore these things that I can have certainty about cannot be physical. Again, because of the first premise that nothing that's physical can actually be known with certainty. Is that clearer?
Yeah, and I think the issue I might see is that when you say knowledge of the physical is fallible, I think that might be begging the question and saying that you're kind of saying that pain is not physical with that premise, because then you go on to say pain is infallible. But if your knowledge of your own pain experience is infallible and pain is physical, then that means there are certain physical knowledges that are infallible.
So I think that this is what constitutes a challenge to the first premise. Then you're saying that there are some physical things that can be known with certainty. And this is interesting. This is the same way that James Fodor objected to this argument. And so the response that I give is I just put the challenge to him. Okay, well, do you agree with me that all knowledge of physical objects is based on sensory perception? If not, then please tell me what this other method of knowing that physical objects exists is, because I'd be so happy to know about it. If you do agree that it's all based on sensory perception, tell me what type of sensory perception is not infallible, or rather is not fallible.
Well, when we talk about my knowledge of the physical world is fallible, and I think in your opening statement, you mentioned like the Matrix, or what if I'm in a hard solipsist universe? So if I think I'm holding, say, like a computer mouse, I would say this is infallible knowledge to the extent that we accept the reality I'm experiencing is actually real. And in the same way, your knowledge that you're experiencing pain is also infallible only if we accept that the world around us is actually real, because the sensation of picking up the computer mouse, I'm feeling something. So whether or not the mouse actually exists, my nerve endings are telling my brain there's an object in my hand and I feel that it's there. In the same way, I can feel pain, whether my body is physical or an illusion, and the pain is actually the damage that my body is receiving is actually not real because my body doesn't exist. So I think that pain and all other sensory inputs are fallible or infallible in the same way.
This seems like it's making the point for me, right? Because I agree that no matter what is sort of going on outside of the mind, right? If I'm touching something, then I have that sensation, right? I have that sensory impression, and I know that more surely. I know that with certainty, even though I don't know with certainty that that's actually being caused by, say, nerve endings sending signals to my brain, right? Because that's all stuff I can be mistaken about, right? I could be in the Matrix. I could be deceived. I could be dreaming right now. What I can't be wrong about, though, is that I'm actually having that particular tactile sensation. And so that's kind of the difference that I'm trying to highlight there, is that there are these things that we know with certainty, but we don't know anything about the physical world with certainty. And so that just is going to straightforwardly lead to the conclusion that therefore the things that I can know with certainty are not physical.
I think if I'm understanding the argument fully, the only thing I would be conceding by accepting the argument is that I don't have a way to disprove hard solipsism.
So would you then just be accepting that we don't know anything with certainty?
Well, when I talk about when I say I accept reductive physicalism, that's with the assumption that I don't live in a solipsist universe. Generally, I just operate under the assumption that the universe around me is actually real, because I really have no choice but to do so. So to whatever extent that I accept I'm experiencing pain, that's the same extent that I use to accept that the world around me is real. So if the pain I experience, the sensations in my brain that I think I'm experiencing that are based on reality, the receptors for pain that happen, if I feel like my arm hurts, but there's nothing wrong with my arm, that sort of pain is happening if it's happening in a hard solipsist universe, and then my arm doesn't actually exist. In the same way, I could pick up the mouse, but if the universe isn't real, neither is the mouse.
Well, and maybe I'll just leave it at this, because I obviously do want to let you have some time to press me on some stuff as well, to be fair. But my argument is not based on you not being able to disprove hard solipsism or something like that. It's just based on you can't have certainty that it's false, right? I believe the physical world exists too, right? I don't believe that, I'm not trying to pull the precept argument on you, right? I'm not trying to say, well, you can't disprove this, therefore God. But what I am saying is I'm pointing to an epistemic difference in sort of what we know about our own first personal sensations, our own thoughts, and sort of the things that we know about the physical world. And I want to say the things we know about the physical world, that's something that's fallible. It's always fallible. But the stuff that I know about my own first person experience, that's not. So because of this sort of different levels in epistemic justification, that points to an ontological difference between the two, implying that the first personal things, those are not material, because the material things, knowledge of that's always fallible. If you want to have the last word on that, that's fine. Or if you want to take it in another direction, take it away, because I've been obviously hogging the time.
Sure. Yeah. The last thing I'll say about that is that my first person experience of pain, for example, is to me on the same level of my first person experience of sight, looking at the world around me. So if the world around me is fake, then so is my pain receptors. And I'm not actually I'm experiencing pain in the same way that I'm experiencing the visualizations of the world around me. But I want to steer us in a slightly different direction with our last couple of minutes. Where do you think minds come from? Did my mind exist before I was born and my body was assigned a mind, or did my body generate a mind, or something else?
Yeah, so this is it's an interesting question, one that there's several different answers to. That I think you can take any of them and still be a substance dualist. It doesn't directly affect the truth of it. But I'm a theist, right? So I hold to what Joshua Ryan Ferris calls creationism about the soul, which is essentially the idea that God creates souls and then pairs them with bodies, presumably at some point, either at conception or shortly thereafter. That would be my broad view on where souls come from. I think God creates them.
Do you think the universe has a finite number of souls it can support, or can God just make all the souls he wants?
So I don't think that souls actually have to be supported by the universe, right? I think that they're sustained in existence by God. And so God could hypothetically sustain an infinite number of them. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question.
Yeah, that's fine. It was kind of a silly question anyway. Do you think that animals have souls?
Okay, good question. So I do think that animals that have conscious experience have souls. It's hard to say exactly where the cutoff might come, but presumably ants don't, because I think there's decent evidence that ants don't actually have conscious experience, so probably they don't. But yeah, any animals that do have conscious experience, I do think have souls. I think that's a straightforward implication of the sorts of arguments I've been giving here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, and not something like, oh, all the other animals except for humans have no soul, but we have souls because we're special. But then it also makes me wonder, do other animals have some sort of afterlife, or do their souls cease to exist when they die? Like what happens to a gorilla when it dies?
Yeah, so this is actually kind of a hot button topic in, as an atheist, I'm sure you're familiar with the problem of evil, or more specifically, the problem of animal suffering. I have the book here somewhere, but Trent Doherty has written a book where he actually posits that animals do have an afterlife, and that this is part of his sort of solution to the problem of animal suffering. I myself am not fully persuaded of. I'll say it's something I'm open to, that animals could have an afterlife, but it's also not. It's something I can't, as a Christian, be dogmatic about, because my theology and my scriptures don't give me any specific indications that animals have an afterlife, but it also doesn't rule that out. So I'm I say it could be the case, but I don't know for sure that it is.
Can souls interact with the physical world through any means besides brains? For example, like Ouija boards or possessing a doll, that sort of thing.
Well, if we're counting like demons as souls, which I think is probably fair, then, or I mean, even God, in a way, could be. Yes, can human souls do that? Certainly not under ordinary circumstances.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see no evidence, and I know this isn't really the topic of the debate, but I see no evidence that demons are real. And a lot of the, in the old times, thousands of years ago, people who were categorized as demon possessed nowadays would be more accurately diagnosed as having some sort of cognitive disorder, which is a function of the brain. So we used to think people with schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder were demon possessed, but now we know that DID, or multi-personality disorder, it's more commonly known as, is a symptom of someone who's likely or often abused as a kid, or someone who's faced unfortunate circumstances when they were young. So the dissociative disorder is a mechanism their brain creates in order to protect themselves from trauma. So I think there's good reason to believe that anything we used to attribute to demons is now sufficiently attributed to functions of the brain, just like everything else that people used to think was spiritual.
I guess 2 points on that. So first, I think I would agree that certainly like some things that have been traditionally attributed to demonic possession, or to like witchcraft, and like the Salem witch trials and stuff, for example, I think a lot of that can certainly be explained in closer to home sorts of ways. So I don't have a problem with that in principle. If you try to generalize that, I mean, I'm not going to say I have a knockdown like argument against that. My belief in angels and demons is, of course, largely downstream from my Christian beliefs, as we sort of discussed in our last conversation together. I know there are people, particularly like Catholic exorcists and people, who have like books and stuff out there where they try to offer more direct cases for the existence of angels and demons, and try to say that, there's phenomena that doesn't fit real well into sort of medical explanations. What I've seen of that, I don't generally find convincing, but I also don't like claim to be super well read in, the literature on exorcisms and whatnot. So that's another way I guess someone could try to respond to you. But generally, I'd just say it's downstream from my Christian beliefs. So I'm not going to like try to offer a direct argument for angels and demons.
Now, this is something we talked about a little bit last time, which you asked me, how do I think I would go about demonstrating mind-body dualism? And one of my answers was, if we could pair, or if we could switch the minds between two individuals, I think that would be all the evidence we need that minds are immaterial and can be transferred back and forth. But that would necessitate that the transfer happens without any physical manipulation of the brain itself. So you mentioned like, oh, if we cut out a piece of the brain or took the entire brain from one person and put it into another, and then they had a switched mind. But if the mind is a function of the brain, then that itself would be consistent with reductive naturalism, or physicalism rather. So are there any other ways in which you think we could, like a knockdown, this would absolutely prove dualism if we could do it, similar to switching minds with another person?
Yeah, well, I mean, even one issue with that is it's always going to be a bit of a question of, how do you really know that you've switched minds, right? I mean, there's various tests you could put forward, but I don't know that you're ever going to have like an infallible one where you couldn't say that, people are like making it up and they really coordinated this really well, and so on and so forth. Largely, and I probably could think of something if I thought about it, like an empirical way to really strongly indicate it. Generally, that's just not how I think about it, because I think arguments for dualism are like largely a priori in nature. So they're kind of like gathered from sort of, Lance is going to hate me for saying this, but the sort of stuff you can learn from the armchair. So it's the sort of stuff you can get by sort of reflecting on the nature of your own thoughts and impressions. And you don't actually have to do empirical research to do it, because my view is that empirical evidence is largely just going to be it's largely going to be non-determinative, because whatever empirical evidence is there, the dualist will just be like, yeah, we're good with that. Yeah, I probably could think of an empirical test that theoretically would prove dualism, but I don't have one off the top of my head.
And I think you mentioned that, if you could switch the minds of two people, it could be an elaborate hoax by them to fool the public. And while that's true, if you could repeat this experiment, 1,000 times over, I think that would be sufficient enough to demonstrate it to a reasonable person. Like if you took, 1,000 random people from around the world and assigned them to switch bodies with someone completely different, and could reliably demonstrate that this person knew, exuberant facts about the other person's life after having never met them at all, I think that would be sufficient evidence even for a skeptic to accept the proposition.
Well, so if I'm sort of playing devil's advocate for the physicalist here, what if I propose sort of something like an idea that Roderick Chisholm put forward? It's unclear if he actually embraced it himself, but Roderick Chisholm had the idea that we might be identical to a sort of like a simple physical particle inside of our brain. I guess the question would be, how would you distinguish what you're saying as evidence for dualism as opposed to what Chisholm is saying? How would you know that you were transferring souls and that you weren't just transferring this very simple, basic, physical particular, which just happened to be the locus of your identity between people? It seems I think that maybe the physicalist could try to get out of it that way.
Tangible part of your brain or body that you're switching between people, then it would be strictly immaterial. So if you had some sort of visual experience or a trance state that you put both people in, or put their heads right next to each other and subjected them to well, I guess, I don't know, if it gets too physical, then
yeah,
you could say that it is still in line with physicalism. So if you blast electricity between two people's minds, maybe there's a physicalist could make the argument that you are moving something physical from one body to the next. And I guess that gets back to something that we talked about earlier, which is that most of the evidence that both of us have brought forward today is consistent with both of our claims. And I think that's the issue with this particular topic. And the reason why so many people debate it is because there's not a clear answer, and we can't put it to rest because the evidence is consistent with both.
Well, with all due respect to you, and of course I do like you, Jed, but I would say I think the evidence that you've brought is consistent with dualism. I don't think that the factors that I brought in my opening statement are actually consistent with physicalism. But I mean, I understand, of course, that you would disagree with me on that.
Yeah. Well, I would disagree and parrot the exact same thing in reverse, where I would say that the arguments you brought forward in case of your position are essentially just arguing that it's, well, I don't know if are we going to get a conclusion time for the debate? Because I don't want to go on a big rant about.
Yeah, you're both going to get a 5-minute closing
Okay.
statement. And
Cool.
we're at about 4 minutes for finishing up the open dialogue.
So when it comes to say manipulating a brain through injury, if I take a metal rod and shove it through my brain, or some other take a substance and I change a fundamental part of who I am permanently, what is it about my mind that stays the same? Or if the mind can be manipulated through the physical in every way that we can possibly identify, then what's left?
Well, I mean, I don't think that everything can, right? The thing that has these thoughts, perceptions, and personality traits, I would say that's the substance, that's the soul, that's the thing that stays the same. What you can manipulate is the thoughts, the perceptions, personality traits, so sort of these things that coalesce around sort of the individual self. But I guess what Descartes called the cogito, right? That's the thing that I'm going to posit stays the same, is the thing that has those thoughts, perceptions, and personality traits.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by that statement, because if we're defining a mind as a thing that has thoughts, feelings, consciousness, and personality trait, and then we can physically alter thoughts, feelings, personality traits, and conscious experience, then when we're saying it's the thing that has these, I mean, to me, the thing is just the physical brain, and there's not anything immaterial going on.
Yeah, and in my view, that would be the soul. So then the question would be sort of how to adjudicate between those two things. But that was just a non-question begging definition that I thought would be acceptable to both of us.
My whole concern with dualism is that if everything, and feel free to provide a different example, but if everything that we can identify as a function of the mind can be changed, altered, destroyed, or manipulated physically, then what's left? I mean, all that's left, it seems like, the thing that has these thoughts and experiences is my brain or my physical body. And if the physical body dies, then so does my conscious experience. So what is it that my mind is even doing if that's not, that my brain isn't doing?
It's having the thoughts, it's undergoing the experiences. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all there is to it.
Yeah, and we might just be talking in circles because from my perspective, the brain is what's having those thoughts, feelings, and conscious experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just go back to, I think, the sorts of considerations I raised in my opening statement. I think for these reasons, it cannot be the brain because it has modal properties that are incompatible with it being the brain. It is able to have certainty about certain things that cannot be true of the brain, right? It is capable of undergoing certain types of, or holding certain types of visual images before itself that you cannot find in the brain. So I would just go back to my opening statement essentially and say, I don't think that any of these things can be true for the brain.
Yeah, when we talk about, and just to go back to the argument from indirect realism, if we were to compare, say, a camera to like the visualizations you get in your head, your eyeballs act a lot like a camera lens, where they're creating an image of the world around you through a lens, and then they're creating a mental image. Mental image is essentially the photo that the camera produces. The photo itself with regard to the camera, if it spits it out, does exist in a physical way. Or let's say it's a digital camera and you're looking at a photo through a screen. All it is ones and zeros, in the same way that mental image is just electrons in your brain. So unless the photo is printed off, all we get from the camera are ones and zeros. And if you were to open up the camera, the image doesn't actually exist within it, but your mental image similarly doesn't exist anywhere in the brain. It's just electrons.
But the photo does actually exist, right?
Only if you print it off. But if it's a digital camera and you don't print it, you can see it through the screen. That's the mental visualization, sure. But it's really only ones and zeros when you look into the guts of the camera.
Okay, I know we're running out of time here. Yeah, I would say that
that's time. So wrap it up.
As far as the screen's concerned, you're looking at like a bunch of different little pixels, a bunch of different things of light. In your mind is where I would say the actual image is at there. That is giving sort of meaning to the various sort of pixels that are being lit up on the screen. But yeah, sorry, I don't think we have time to give more details than that.
Yeah, we can move on. Sure.
All right. So we will now move on to closing statements. I didn't actually ask which of you would like to take the first closing statements. So let's sort that out now. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, typically whoever has the first opening statement gets the last word. So I'd be happy to go first in my closing statement.
So then you are up and I will hit the timer as soon as you start. All right.
Perfect. So yeah, today we talked about mind-body dualism versus reductive physicalism. All the evidence that we find within the mind, the brain, it's all consistent, and I would say points to the idea that our minds are a function of our physical brain. There's nothing non-physical going on. Everything that we can identify with the brain, we can pinpoint where it's happening. Within the brain, we can measure the electricity that's moving around in our brain in order to create these mental images. We can manipulate, alter, destroy, and recreate different character traits, values, beliefs, personality, memories. Everything is malleable by manipulating the physical brain. If there was anything about my soul or my mind that was not physical, then surely there would have to be something that can't be altered through adjusting the physical brain. And even my conscious experience can be drastically altered or shut down by ingesting certain chemicals or drugs. I can take put the gas mask on, I go to sleep, my conscious experience ends, I'm still alive, but by ingesting a substance, I'm blocking the conscious experience from manifesting within my brain. I don't think any of the arguments we heard today from Dave point to or are exclusively in line with mind-body dualism. All of them can be explained by physical material. The first argument is basically just saying it's not logically impossible, therefore it's possible. I think this is a weak argument and can be applied to any claim whatsoever. Indirect realism, the idea that I have a mental picture in my head based on my sensory perception, it's based on the brain creating a mental picture. So even though you can't crack open my brain and look at the picture from someone else's perspective, the images, you could say, don't exist anywhere per se, but they are tied to the physical world. So I have a mental image of the room around me, and it's not completely fabricated in the sense that my brain is making it up 100%. It's based on the world around me. And with most people, it's accurate to maybe 99%. The things I see and the things I can touch and hear and smell, most of these things are actually real. So I'm interacting with a reality that's really around me. That is, of course, assuming that reality is actually what it appears to be. And of course, both of us are assuming that hard solipsism isn't the case. If it was, then the wall I'm touching next to me is actually a fake wall. And the sensation I get when I touch it, or the visualization I get when I look at it, is actually fake. My brain is making it up or being spoon-fed information. In the same way, if I'm experiencing pain in my head, like I think I'm experiencing pain because I'm exposed to electricity, that pain is a real first-person experience, just like the sight of the wall next to me is a first-person experience. So the pain is infallible in the same way that my sight of the wall is infallible, because the pain is only caused by sensations and physical things that are happening within the brain. The brain experiences and causes pain to the perceptor. So in the brain, we wouldn't have any pain. If I was a mind floating out in the ether, like once I get to heaven, there's presumably no pain. Or if a mind could exist without a body, there's no reason to believe that it would experience pain because it doesn't have any pain receptors. So everything that we identify as a part of the mind is contingent with the physical body, and I see insufficient evidence to demonstrate otherwise. Thanks.
All right. We will turn it over to you, Dave. You will have 5 minutes as soon as you're ready to go.
Awesome. All right. Well, again, thank you, Lance, for hosting the debate, and Jed, I appreciate you participating. I know it was a little bit last minute. We tried to find another opponent, and he backed out at the last minute. So I do appreciate you for stepping in, Jed. I do appreciate that. Just to kind of briefly recap, I think I argued that we possess certain modal properties that physical objects cannot possess. I've argued that indirect realism is a correct theory of perception, and that indirect realism entails that there are immaterial mental entities. And then I've argued that we can have certainty about certain propositions, while we cannot have certainty about anything physical, which entails that there are at least some immaterial mental entities. And I do appreciate the way, that Jed went at this. And I know we didn't have a ton of time to prepare, but I don't think we had clear objections to these arguments. It wasn't clear which premises were being rejected or why. So I do think that the case for dualism stands unscathed. One last thing I just want to say to Jed here in closing is that I would really encourage you to change the Flying Spaghetti Auditor moniker. And to do it before you get real big, so it doesn't have to be like, Alex O'Connor when he had to change from Cosmic Skeptic. The reason why is because I think it's kind of like a new atheist, edgelord title. And I get it, but a lot of my philosophy of religion friends were like, oh, I'm just not going to tune into this debate because this guy sounds like a clown because of that, including my atheist friends, by the way. And I was I had to tell him no, Jed's actually a good guy. He can have good high level conversations. I've had him with him before. But I think you might do a better job marketing yourself to that demographic if you went with a different moniker. Just my recommendation, you do you. So yeah, just in contrast, thanks everyone for tuning in. I really enjoyed the debate, and thanks for having us on, Lance.
Yeah, no worries. All right. So with that, I'd like to thank both of our debaters. That was pretty awesome. I'm glad everything went pretty smoothly. And we are going to move on to the Q&A. Someone asked in the chat how long it's going to go. I think it's going to go until we run out of steam or somebody wants to get out of here and go take a bathroom break or something. I don't want to keep it going if somebody's got to go, and it could be any one of us. So we're playing Russian roulette with the time, and we'll just see what happens. I asked people to at me with the questions. I've been keeping a list from the first question I decided to accept up until the current one. Just a quick question for both of you. Should I skip over questions that are off topic, or are you okay with the question as long as it, like, from looking at it, it seems reasonable?
I'm okay with off topic. I was also going to say, just to keep it fair, a lot of times in these debates, and just knowing your audience demographic in this particular case, Lance, it's probably going to be me who gets hit with a lot more questions than Jed. I think to keep it fair, once one person answers a question, give maybe the other person a chance to give some thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to pair the same thing. I'm okay with any and all questions, and even if they're not questions, sometimes statements invoke great conversations between the two of us. And if it's okay with you, Lance, any question or comment that sparks a bit of back and forth between Dave and I'm open to as well.
Okay, that sounds good. So if you want to have a back and forth, I'll let you negotiate that. I guess one thing I'll just say is I do think it's sometimes something that could happen with Q&As is people can get really caught up in answering a question. So in this case, if you're both okay with it, I'll try to push you along if I feel like it might be stalling out on that question. And like, there's a bunch of questions and people love to get their questions answered. So we cool with that?
I will try to be as brief as I can.
Awesome. Okay. So our first question is for Jed, and I'll try to start pulling them up on here because I have a list. So it's going to make it a little tricky. The first question for Jed is, you said that you don't think there's any evidence for demons. In your view, what would count as evidence for demons?
It's a good question. What's it called? Nefarious? You guys seen that movie? So essentially it's actually pretty good. Or at least it's okay. I mean, except for the anti-abortion stuff, but it's a movie about a gentleman who's possessed by a demon, but nobody believes him. And so there's a psychiatrist who's tasked with determining whether he's actually possessed by a demon or not. And by the end of the movie, the demon does a sufficient job convincing him that he is possessed. So what would be good evidence that demon possession is real? Well, if a person was possessed by a demon and, they got, if they could manipulate reality in a way that a normal person couldn't, like presumably demons have more power than regular people. Even Dave mentioned how he thinks demons may have the ability to go into and out of different bodies, but humans are kind of stuck within the same body or may not be able to wander the earth and travel into different bodies. So if a demon could sufficiently demonstrate that it can go into multiple bodies and relay information from one body to the next, or possess an object, or make the lights explode on command or something like that, I think that might be a good start.
Yeah, I think you could have something like that in the way of direct evidence. Alternatively, you could go the route that I do, which would just be, I think that there's good evidence for Christianity based on primarily the resurrection of Jesus. Christianity is plausibly going to commit you to the existence of angels and demons. So the evidence for Christianity is evidence for the existence of demons. That's roughly the route that I go.
I would reject that only because I think accepting, say, the resurrection of Jesus, if there were good evidence for it, doesn't necessarily tie you to the claims within the Bible or even the New Testament or even things that Jesus reportedly said or did, because it's conceivably possible that a resurrection actually did happen and Jesus rose from the dead, but the Bible is not a completely accurate source of information. So it's possible demons aren't real, but Jesus is God and rose from the dead. Not that I believe that, but just that it's possible.
By itself, the bare proposition Jesus rose from the dead is not going to commit you to the existence of demons. But if you use the sort of argument that I give for the resurrection, which is based on sort of robust gospel historical reliability, that is more plausibly going to commit you to demons, because obviously the Gospels are full of stories of demonic possession and Jesus being an exorcist. So if you buy the sort of resurrection argument that I would give, then that is it's going to be a lot more of a direct route to the existence of angels and demons.
All right. So the next question is from Alan, and it's for Dave. Were there souls in the universe before there were brains, or did brains create immaterial souls at a given point in time?
Well, assuming he's not talking about, if he's talking about human, okay, let me back up a little bit. So I'm a theist, right? So I believe that God exists, and I believe that God is well, I'm a Trinitarian, so I believe that God is actually comprised of 3 different conscious minds or souls. But so in that sense, I say that souls existed before brains existed. Now, if he's talking about human souls, which I assume that he probably is, I'm a Cartesian dualist, so I think that God, and I'm a creationist about souls, as I mentioned. So I think that God creates a soul and pairs it to a body probably at around the time of conception is when that happens. Good anti-abortion argument right there, Jed. No, I'm kidding. So that would be broadly my thought on it, is that the two come into existence pretty close at the same time. If I were an emergent dualist, if I felt pressure to go there based on the sorts of considerations that Jed was raising, then I would say that brains existed before human souls and that they were generated by human brains. So that's roughly my thoughts on that.
One point I want to, because you mentioned abortions, I got to chime in. I would say that your position that a soul is given to a body at the moment of conception is not supported by biblical scripture, but rather an argument where a soul is given to a body at the moment of birth would be more in line with the biblical scriptures, because there's verses that say when you're taking a census, the only people that count are people who are already born. Life begins at first breath, or God breathed the breath of life into Adam. And there's also a recipe to purposefully induce an abortion or miscarriage to a woman in Numbers 5, presumably because God doesn't consider unborn fetuses worth saving because, it was formed by adultery. So just go ahead and abort it. No big deal. So I think there's a good case to be made that souls within the Bible are given at birth rather than conception.
On the biblical front, I'll disagree with your readings of all of these passages, but of course that'll take us down a big long rabbit hole. As far as the science of it is concerned, I think that there's abundant evidence that fetuses possess conscious experience from very early on, and to the extent that the sorts of arguments for substance dualism indicate that conscious experience is the only is essentially can only be possessed by a being with a soul, that would just provide a completely separate argument against abortion, like wholly apart from scriptural considerations.
Yeah, I would only add that the conscious experience of, I don't have the number of weeks, in front of me, but the conscious experience that a fetus, to whatever extent that it can experience anything, is not gained right away, and certainly a newly conceived zygote doesn't have any conscious experience whatsoever. So this would be something added to the conscious experience is something a fetus gains, not right away, but later in development. I don't know the number of weeks off the top of my head, but certainly not right at the beginning.
I think it's like 4 weeks when you start having definite signs of it.
We might have to fact check that, but we can move on.
All right. So the next question is for Jed. The question is from Dodd the Disgraced, who asks, do you have any answer to the hard problem of consciousness from a purely scientific perspective?
Maybe Dave or you can help me out on what the hard problem of consciousness is. So I don't really think that consciousness is that big of a problem, and maybe that's from a lack of understanding what the problem actually is. But it seems to me like consciousness is just the manifestation of all the conglomerate experiences of my brain and sensory input. And we talked a little bit earlier about animals and whether they have a soul or a mind that's immaterial. I think that consciousness is just a function of a brain, and the smarter and better an animal or organism is at manipulating the world around them, the higher degree of consciousness they gain. So I think consciousness more so comes as a gradient and not so much a you either have it or you don't type thing. So maybe ants have no consciousness whatsoever, like Dave said. Something like a small lizard certainly has some kind of consciousness, and something like a great ape, another great ape like us, or a gorilla would have a sense of consciousness that's, very similar to our own. So, but Dave, you can chime in with your thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I really have any on that.
All right, well, we can move on. So the next question, and this, I'm not even doing them in this order. They just happen to be bouncing back and forth between you serendipitously. But the next question is for you, Dave, from also Dodd the Disgraced, who asks, how does he tackle the mind-body problem? It's directed at you, but then he says he. Anyway, how do you tackle the mind-body problem? How does non-physical causally relate to the physical? I feel like you kind of already addressed that, but what do you have to say if you have something brief to say?
It sounds like he's bringing up basically the interaction problem for substance dualism, which I have referred to elsewhere as the most overrated objection to substance dualism ever. If you want my extended response, I have a video on my YouTube channel called Answering Objections to Substance Dualism, where I give, I think, 3 or 4 different responses to it. But the basic answer is I think that the mind interacts with the body or the brain directly by means of a basic causal relation. I don't see any need to add any, mechanistic hocus pocus in there to say this is how it does it. There's presumably some sort of brain process that goes on as neuroscience reveals that. I'm happy to accept it. And then I'm just going to stick the causal activity of the soul prior to whatever neuroscience discovers is going on prior to a bodily movement.
All right, Jed, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just be curious to know what's when he's asking about like the mechanism of connection between the mind and the body, or how does the mind, would it even be possible for us, or do you think it's possible for us to measure the influence the mind has on the body? How is the mind directing the body, or what's not only the connection between the two, but how is the mind influencing the body if it's immaterial? Because to me, it doesn't make sense that something immaterial could influence something material without itself being material.
Yeah, that's kind of just about as far as most of the thinking on the interaction problem goes, is it's like, it's hard to see how this different type of thing can interact with this other thing. The thing is, if you sort of ask, how does one material object interact with another material object? It's not really any clearer. I am not convinced that physicalists have given us a super great analysis of physical to physical interaction or causation. In the end, you end up having to similarly resort to a basic causal relation. One thing just does cause the other. Eventually, the causal chain gets exhausted and there's something at the beginning of it. I just say the dualist can do the same thing and just put the soul at the start of the causal chain. And I think that any mystery involved likely just results from the notion of causation itself and has actually nothing to do with the material to immaterial interaction.
Yeah, when it comes to material things interacting with other material things, it seems pretty obvious and apparent how that interaction is happening. Particles and energy are coming into contact with each other and behaving in certain ways based on their reaction. But when it comes to immaterial, I don't see where the interaction is happening, or that there's ever been a demonstration that there's interaction happening.
Okay, but that's different, right? That's an epistemological objection of why I think that it's happening in the first place. It's not an in principle, conceptual issue of that there's some reason why the two couldn't interact. As far as the example that you gave, right? I mean, sure, we can say that matter and energy, right, coming into contact with one another has causal repercussions. That's evident enough. But if the question is what is the mechanism by which the energy gets transferred to the other, I don't think that you have a better explanation of that than that's just kind of the way it works.
But at least we can demonstrate that the energy is coming from somewhere. With the mind and body interaction, there's, from your perspective, some influence that the mind has on the body, but we have no way of measuring what the influence is, what's changing in the body based on the mind's interaction.
That's fine, but I just don't think that that's the interaction problem anymore. That's just saying there's no evidence for a soul.
Yeah, we can move on from there if we want.
All right. Next question is for Dave, and we got some more for both of you, so don't worry. So this is from Harmonica Luke, who asks, is brain damage forcing people with associated amnesia to lie when asked if they remember things. And then in parentheses, they're still capable of controlling their body to say yes in response to other questions, or it just says yes to other questions.
I'm going to say I probably don't know enough about the particular condition to give an informed answer to that.
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I even understand it.
Yeah. The question is brain damage forcing people with associated amnesia to lie when asked if they remember things?
Is it forcing them to lie when they're asked if they remember
I
things?
think the idea is if you're a dualist, like the person actually has all this knowledge and it's not really connected to the body's like impairing their access or ability to articulate it, but they actually do know. They're just somehow doing something, like they're unable to articulate their knowledge. Maybe there's something like that behind the idea.
He might be getting at like memory in general, which isn't something we talked about extensively during our discussion. So memories are all formed and stored within the brain, and we, if memories can be destroyed by physically altering the brain, then when I die and my mind goes elsewhere from my body, how is it that I retain any of my memories if they're stored within my body?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but Harmonica Luke has clarified and asked a bit more, so I'm going to allow it and bring that up here. So here it is. Basis of the question: are memories stored in the soul? Do souls have memory? Then they should still remember when they have brain damage, amnesia.
I would say the souls are, or memories are like possessed by the soul. I'm not sure it's a particularly well-formed question to ask where they're stored. I'm fine with saying that like the brain has something to do with like recalling particular memories to mind. And that, you know, if it's just not stored anywhere, then the memory just doesn't exist unless it's like created at some later time.
Do you think that when we die, because our bodies don't, or our brains don't store all the memories that we ever gain, you know, only certain memories are locked into long-term memory, which is why, you know, you can't recall every experience you've ever had. But when you die, do you think that you will gain access to every experience you've ever had? Or are you going to have a perfect memory of everything that you've ever done?
As a Christian, I find that unlikely because, you know, we're told afterlife that there's no more tears and no more pain. And it would seem to indicate that like sad memories, at least, are not restored. Fundamentally, I have no idea what the afterlife is going to be like beyond, you know, based on my religious beliefs, what scripture reveals to me. So I can really only speculate. But I would be surprised if I had access to like every last memory of every experience I ever had.
This is probably one of the best arguments I've heard towards the notion that heaven is a horrible place that I have no interest in going to, because in order to enter heaven, large portions of my memory have to be wiped out. I have to lose my memory of everything that's ever made me sad, or fundamentally changed in such a way that those memories no longer make me sad. So a great example that you've probably heard before is that if my parents die and go to heaven, but since I'm an atheist, I'll go to hell, the thought of me burning and suffering would surely cause my parents a lot of sadness and grief. But if there's no sadness and grief in heaven, then either that means my parents' memory of me has been wiped away, or they're no longer sad by the thought of me being tortured forever. And if that's the case, or either way, they're no longer the same person they were before.
Well, that argument's probably not going to hold a whole lot of force with me because I don't hold to the eternal conscious torment view of hell. But yeah, I mean, plausibly, like people like William Lane Craig who do hold to that, hold to some sort of memory wipe view. There are other options open to Christians who do hold to an eternal conscious torment view of hell. But since I don't in the first place, I just feel like that's kind of not an issue for me.
So you reject verses like Revelation 20:10, which call hell eternal torment?
No, I mean, the verses actually don't say that, right? They say that the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. It doesn't say that their torment goes on forever and ever. But the language that's used there, I mean, the exact same language is used in Isaiah, where it talks about the smoke of the destruction of, I forget which city it is, but some city is destroyed, and it says that the smoke of it goes up forever and ever. The terms there can be translated as ages and ages. Either way, I mean, you're on dubious ground if your whole argument is based on the book of Revelation, which contains a ton of figurative language.
Well, one thing I would just point to is that the verse I mentioned, Revelation 20:10 doesn't talk about smoke. It says the devil was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown. They will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
Okay, my bad. I thought you were talking about the later one. As far as I know, that's restricted to the devil and his angels, right? It doesn't talk about people.
Well, that verse is only talking about the devil and the beast being tortured forever in hell. But this place, hell, the lake of burning sulfur, is the same location that the Bible says unbelievers are going to be sent.
That's fine. It doesn't mean that they exist there eternally.
Yeah, that's true. It could be a finite torture and then annihilation.
Right. That would be broadly my view. And I think that that's actually supported by a lot of other passages in Scripture, which very strongly indicate that people who go to hell are destroyed, annihilated, they die, they cease existing.
Which the thought of me being annihilated, I think would also surely cause my parents a lot of sadness.
Yeah, that would probably be the better way to try to press the argument against my position. And I mean, again, it's speculative how you want to deal with that. I would say in some way or other, they would not be sad about that in the end, or at any rate, they would not have tears of sadness about that because, of course, Scripture is clear that those are all wiped away. Exactly how that works, that's a question I'm happy to leave up to God.
All right, we ready for the next question?
I think so.
Yeah, we can move on.
All right, next question is from Grant, and this is for both of you. The question is, do souls require consciousness? That is, can you have consciousness without a soul, or can you have a soul without consciousness?
Do you want to take that one first, Jed, or you want me to?
Well, I don't believe souls exist. So I would say you can have consciousness without a soul. As far as being like, as an internal critique towards Christianity, if I were to accept that mind-body dualism exists or that souls exist, someone who's in a coma presumably could have a soul still hidden away that's not currently experiencing any conscious experience. But I wouldn't think from a Christian perspective, someone could be conscious and experiencing life without a soul because your conscious experience or the fact that you are alive necessitates that you have a soul. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts more than mine.
So I do think you can have a soul without consciousness because I think souls require the potential for consciousness. But like presumably, say you go into a dreamless sleep, right? You don't have any conscious experience. I think the soul still exists. So a soul is not required to have conscious experience, but it is required to have the capacity or potential for conscious experience. As for whether you can have conscious experience in the absence of a soul, I mean, I think a proper analysis of consciousness, like conscious experience, is going to yield that it has to be, as discussed in my opening statement. Maybe you could try to say that like a physical brain has these sort of immaterial mental properties along the line of something like property dualism. Although I'm pretty persuaded by arguments from philosophers like Ralph Steven Weir that property dualism really pretty much leads to substance dualism. So kind of whether you think that you can have a physical object that has immaterial states of consciousness is largely going to depend on how you judge the sorts of arguments that property dualism entails substance dualism.
All right, next question.
Next question.
All right, we got a couple more for Dave, so hopefully we can swing stuff back towards you, Jed. But here we go. This says for both, but mostly directed at Dave, and it's from Ben Singleton. Do you think that widespread cognitive biases speak in favor of consciousness being shaped by evolutionary factors and supports physicalism?
I don't think that it supports physicalism in any way. It could potentially indicate that evolution had some impact on the sort of way in which our brain relates to sort of our conscious experiences. I would want to resist that conclusion as well, but I think that's the most it could potentially indicate. I don't think it says anything in favor of physicalism, fundamentally because I think that things like beliefs are just incompatible with physicalism in the first place.
Yeah, regarding evolution and its compatibility with Christianity, if you were to fully accept evolution and reject young earth creationism, then I think that poses some issues for souls and when God decided to give creatures souls or different animals souls. So under Dave's model, where conscious creatures besides humans have a soul, through the evolutionary process, at the very beginning, when there was only single cell or simple multi-cell organisms that have no conscious experience, at some point, God had to decide, okay, now this organism has a mutation, which is just complex enough that I'm going to grant it a soul. But none of the other organisms in its population have a soul yet, only this one. And then once that mutation became widespread, then all of its descendants had a soul. And then possibly there was a lineage from that organism that became even more simple. And then the soul was not given to its descendant. So I think it's kind of messy if you start trying to add souls into the scientific understanding of evolution. But if you were to be a complete young earth creationist, it's pretty straightforward that God made all these kinds of animals and humans separately and just decided which ones had souls and which ones wouldn't have souls. Dave and I spoke a little bit last time about creationism and evolution. And Dave, you had kind of a mixture of the two, if I remember correctly, where you accepted evolution, but it was guided. And then the Adam and Eve story is also real. So maybe you could refresh my memory on your position about evolution and creationism.
My formal position is agnosticism, but I'm most favorable to some sort of old earth creationism where you have millions of years, but you don't have common descent.
So you believe that God created independent lines of organisms, which are then subject to evolution within their kind?
Yeah, that'd probably be the sort of position that I'm most favorable to. Again, I don't have dogmatic positions here because evolutionary biology is not my forte.
Sure.
Okay, so incidentally, the next question was Dave's stance on evolution. So scientific origins, that was answered. So we'll move on to the next question. So the next one is from Facundo. This one was a little tough for me to parse, so I'm hoping you'll follow it. Isn't distinguishing things by what we know about them the masked man fallacy? And then there's a quote, I know a lot about Bruce Wayne. I don't know much about Batman. Therefore, Bruce Wayne isn't Batman. And I believe this was directed at you, Dave, but either of you can address this.
Yeah, I think he's probably making some objection probably to my third argument based on sort of some well-known difficulties involved in like trying to determine properties based on epistemic. They're basically their epistemic characteristics. I think that's correct. In which case, I mean, that's a lot to get into. If you want my full answer to that, see my video responding to Auditor, where he kind of raised this epistemic properties objection to my argument from introspection, and I give a fuller response there than what I think I have the time to do here.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on that question.
Okay, fair enough. Are you all okay with a silly question, or should I go only for serious ones?
Hit us with it.
We need some laughs, Lance. You're dying out here.
All right. Yeah, I don't know. I could be kind of a stodgy and boring at times, but
Boring,
okay.
You're a dad. Man.
So this is a question from Grant, and it's just asking you basically like which superhero you prefer, and this is for both of you. So Batman, Superman, or Iron Man?
Batman, of course.
Depends on prefer. I mean, if I'm going to watch the movie, probably Batman, like The Dark Knight, or Iron Man is more interesting to me. But which superhero do I think is like the coolest in terms of their powers? Obviously Superman, because Iron Man and Batman aren't actually super. They don't actually have powers as far as I know. They're just rich and smart and build cool stuff. So Superman's the only one actually with pretty extraordinary powers.
All right, this is directed at me, and I feel like this one would be okay for me to answer. So I am like a Batman partisan. I've always just really liked the idea of someone that doesn't have powers, like outsmarting their enemies and just being planning contingencies for everything. I just think that's a cool way of handling things. But
okay,
I don't know if those questions tell us something about ourselves.
Superheroes.
Sorry, Dave?
That Lance officially has based opinions on superheroes.
I don't know if that's based or not, but all right, let's go to the next one. This is from Goblin Lord. And the question is, for the thought experiment where David asked to imagine having the physical part of you separated from you, is this not asking the other person to accept in the first part that this looks like it got cut off. So
I
for the
think
first
I can
sentence,
probably anticipate what he's asking. I think he's probably
yeah, I
saying,
don't see the rest of the question, so I don't know where it got cut off to. I'd have to go dig it up.
I suspect he's saying the very like invitation to engage in the thought experiments that I offered in support of the third premise of my modal argument is effectively it's asking the person to sort of concede the debate from the start. I'd say not necessarily, right? You can just take it as like an invitation, or like, hey, see, do you think that like Descartes' malicious demon, like, is that a conceivable scenario for you, right? Is body switching scenario for you? Are out of body experiences, like, are these conceivable? Now, like, if you straightforwardly just like, yeah, I tried and I can't do it, bro, then like, I'm not going to try to cram it down your throat. But to most people, I mean, these seem like readily conceivable scenarios, right? Like introductory philosophy textbooks generally have like students scratching their head about how to solve the problem of external world skepticism, right? Like it's not particularly controversial to say that these are conceivable states of affairs. Additionally, you could, a lot of philosophers, probably even Lance himself takes, which is just that conceivability is straightforwardly not a good guide to determining what is logically possible because, you know, they think there are counterexamples or whatever. I have a long video on my channel sort of go through some of the literature on this and explain why I defend conceivability as a good guide to possibility. But that would be another way where you could agree that, yeah, out of body experiences, like that's conceivable, but I just reject that conceivability indicates possibility. So that's for two reasons. It doesn't ask the skeptic to concede the debate from the start.
Yeah, I would agree with the very last thing you said, that conceivability doesn't demonstrate possibility. So I could conceive of a great many things, like the existence of a flying spaghetti monster, but that doesn't mean that this entity is actually real, or that there's just not a logical contradiction entailed with the claim itself. And the absence of a logical contradiction certainly doesn't mean that something is physically possible or the case, or even likely.
Well, remember, the modal scope of my modal argument is logical possibility, not physical possibility.
Sure. And I'd say it's also logically possible that the material is all that exists and there is no immaterial mind. That's also logically possible.
And no thought experiments comparable to the ones offered in support of the modal argument that would actually support the modal premise of, or would support that statement.
Yeah, we might go around and round in circles again, so we better move on.
All right. We'll try to get through them all. We were down to 2 questions, and then we had about 4 more come in, and that's it so far. So we might be able to get through them. I thought these would like go off for like 30 minutes. Okay. So next one. This is from Akil. Does Dave have a version of his argument for people skeptical of mind and mental states as actual things? For example, what would he say to a behaviorist? And I'll just add, there's also like eliminativists, like the Churchlands and stuff. What would you say to them?
Yeah, there's a few different ways you can go. A lot of these positions are just like so straightforwardly contrary to what seems obvious to me that it's almost hard to know how to like take them seriously. And I don't mean that in like a dismissive kind of way, but it just seems like it seems absurd to me to say that like thoughts and experiences are not like actual concrete things, because that just seems so transparently clear. One way that I have gone about arguing against this position is to say, like, if you don't think that like thoughts are actual like discrete things, then I think global skepticism follows from that, given just about any analysis of knowledge that is going to have knowledge be some type of true belief with something else on there. I would suggest justification as the other condition for knowledge. Obviously, that's controversial, but whatever it is, belief is an essential component of knowledge by just about every analysis on there. And I think, like, in order to bear truth values, it has to be an existing thing. Like, I don't think non-existence can bear values like truth and falsehood. So if you are basically an eliminativist about thoughts, you're an eliminativist about beliefs, which means you're an eliminativist about knowledge. And if there's no knowledge, then you have global skepticism. If someone wants to bite the bullet on that, I don't really know where to go with them from there. But that is an argument against people who want to just deny that there are such things as thoughts.
Yeah, I would say that thoughts don't exist onto themselves. They're not things within the universe, but rather they're brain states. So I have a thought about whether there's a God or not, and my thought that I have no reason to believe that there's a God is not something that exists onto itself. It's just a position on a claim. And I think that most of our brain states are in fact positions on claims, where most things, as far as I'm aware, can be reduced to a certain position on a claim. Like, am I convinced that I'm holding a phone in my hand? Yes. Am I convinced that that phone is real? Am I convinced that I'm experiencing a actual reality right now? Yes. So, yeah, even things that are, claims themselves and my positions on them are not existent unto themselves. They're just, they're just that. They're my positions, abstract ideas.
That's it's funny you say that, because the next question for you, Jed, is, are thoughts physical?
Thoughts are physical in the way that they are the physical, thing that we could observe is the brain state itself, or a pathway of electricity through certain neurons in your brain. Every thought that you have is represented by a certain neural pathway. And a lot of times when you're trying to remember something that you're like, oh, what was the name of that actor that was in that movie? Oh, what was the name of that movie? Oh, this other actor was in it. Your brain starts to create these recognize these different patterns. And by recognizing, Scarlett Johansson was in the movie. Oh, the movie had a dinosaur in it. Oh, the name of the movie was such and such. And then by connecting all these dots, it triggers another pathway. Oh, now I remember the actor from that movie. It was Brendan Fraser. So this thing that isn't right on the cusp of your grabbable knowledge can be retrieved from your memory storage through activating other similar motor neural pathways. And a lot of times people who are really great at remembering things are using mnemonic devices and other tools to help them remember by associating certain things with other things that help them remember. So
are you saying that you think that thoughts are identical to neural pathways?
The physical manifestation of a thought is the neural pathway, but thoughts themselves can also be described as abstract ideas.
Is the physical manifestation something distinct from the thought?
Is it distinct from the thought? In the way that we describe them, yes. So the physical manifestation is just a pathway of electricity, and we would have no idea of knowing what the thought represents just simply by looking at somebody's brain scan. So the thoughts themselves are necessarily first person in the sense that no one else can know it. That doesn't mean that it's immaterial, because there still is a material, there's material behind it, in the same way that a computer program is comprised of ones and zeros. But if I see a giant screen of ones and zeros, I have no idea what it's supposed to represent. It takes a computer to turn that into something that I can recognize.
Can a neural pathway be true or false?
A neural pathway that represents a belief could be true or false based on its correspondence with reality.
Okay, so how does a neural path correspond to, say, like, the thought is that Brendan Fraser was in the movie, right? How does the neural pathway correspond to the fact that Brendan Fraser was in the movie, when, like,
sure,
very clearly, like, the two have very different properties?
Yeah. So if I have a thought, Brendan Fraser is in this movie, it's either true or false. If we're talking about The Mummy, then it's a true thought. But regardless of whether Brendan was in the movie or not, the fact that I have the neural pathway is true. So it's true that my brain is experiencing a thought, but that thought may or may not correspond with reality.
Right. The proposition about that is true. And I'm asking if the neural pathway itself can be true. I mean, to me, to say a neural pathway can be true or false is like as silly as saying that a tree can be true or false, or an apple can, or any other physical object can be true or false. It just seems like a straightforward category error. But that was the only point I was trying to make.
Sure. And I think that's a reasonable distinction to make. And I think if we were to say like a tree is true, it doesn't really make sense, because that's not the way language works. But if we were to say, is it true that this tree exists, then we could say that claim is either true or false.
Right, because you're describing a proposition, a mental entity, which is about the tree. But that's kind of
Right.
the point I'm making. You could have a mental thought about your neural pathway that is true. I don't think the neural pathway itself can be true. But if you're trying to identify neural pathways with thoughts, then you effectively have to say neural pathways can be true or false. And so that was kind of the problem I was trying to highlight.
Yeah, and I suppose if you're gonna phrase it like that, then you could say a neural pathway is true, just like I could say, is the claim I'm hiding behind this hand true? Well, you don't know if it's true or not until you learn what the claim is. So similarly, if you don't know what my neural pathway represents, you are incapable of distinguishing whether it's true or false. But you have to learn what the claim is in order to make that judgment.
I would just say that it's transparently obvious that neural pathways are not truth apt, but I'll leave it at that.
All right. Another question for Dave. Sorry they turned in all Dave questions. You
That's
already
okay.
predicted this, but as long as you both get a chance to say something, then I'm happy. Okay. I feel like you kind of already addressed this too, but this is from Facundo. Do you accept that brain dead patients have no conscious experiences? How isn't that the same for embryos?
I don't actually know if they have no conscious experiences or not, but we could accept that they don't, and I could accept that an embryo at like a certain stage also doesn't have conscious experience. Remember, souls only need to have the capacity or potential for conscious experience. They don't actually have to be undergoing it.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable answer. There's been times where somebody thought, or a patient was in a coma and the people around them thought, oh, they're brain dead. They can't hear anything. They have no conscious experience whatsoever. The patient, after waking up, lets everyone around them know, I was in fact conscious the whole time and I could hear everything that you were saying. And so it gave them a great amount of stress to hear their family members debating about whether to pull the plug on them or not. So whether someone in a coma or that we think is brain dead is actually conscious or having any sort of experience, like Dave said, I think may not be always known or readily available. But when it comes to something like a zygote or a newly developing fetus, I think it's abundantly clear that it's not having any sort of conscious experience because it's not capable of that yet, because its brain and neural faculties, its neurons haven't developed in a way that allows it to have a conscious experience. But you could say that either one of those things has a soul because God gave it a soul, and the soul doesn't leave the body until it dies, and it goes into the body once it's conceived. If you're going to define it that way, then you could believe that.
All right. Next, another question for Dave. What's your take on the other minds problem? How can we verify someone has a soul or immaterial mind in ways which isn't conceivably replicable by mindless beings?
Yeah, I'd have to probably think about the last part of that question a little more to parse out what exactly Leo's saying there. By the way, shout out. How's it going, Leo? Good to see you here. But yeah, broadly, my approach to the problem of other minds is that we infer their existence largely the same way we infer the existence of physical objects. I just think that other beings have conscious experience similar to mine is the best explanation for why they sort of exemplify bodily movements and actions similar to my own.
Yeah, unless you're going to accept hard solipsism, I think it's pretty trivially obvious that other minds exist within other brains, or that other brains are creating conscious experiences like my own. I have a body and I'm a conscious ape running around with thoughts and feelings, and I can see other people are very much like me, and I have every reason to believe that these other apes running around have their own conscious experience, feelings, and emotions and values. And that's evidenced by the fact that when I talk to somebody else, they present me with ideas that either I haven't learned or I would never come up with on my own, or their values are drastically different from mine, or their behavior is drastically different from mine. So yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that other minds exist within other brains.
All right. We only got a few more questions, so we might be able to wrap it up. There's a quick one for you, Dave, from Facundo, who says, Dave, you got my Man question right. Thank you. Have you really answered the masked man fallacy objection elsewhere? I'll have to go look it up.
Which one was the masked man objection? I've already forgot.
The
Which
one, the Batman one.
Oh, wait, no, we're back to superheroes?
No, this was about like if you know who Bruce Wayne is, but you don't know anything about Batman.
Right. Yes, okay. I forgot that was the technical name for it. Yeah, I always had a different name for that fallacy. But yes, I addressed that in my video responding to James Fodor on substance dualism. I think it's called Defending Dualism, a response to James Fodor. So yes, I just refer you to that video.
What's the technical name for that fallacy, Dave?
I guess masked man fallacy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have to admit I'm not very familiar with it.
Okay.
I'm familiar with it, but just under a different name. Sorry, Lance, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, it's all good. We ready to move on?
I believe so.
Cool. Another question for Dave. I'm really sorry about that. It's just that's how it turned out. So it's from Leophilius. It's very similar to the previous one, which is what do you think of P zombies? Is it coherent for there to be an agent that behaves as if it's a soul but doesn't actually have a soul?
Yes, I do think that it's a coherent idea.
Okay.
The last part of the question, is it coherent for an individual to behave as though they have a soul when they really don't?
Yep.
I think he's just alluding to like the idea of a philosophical zombie, which is basically it's somebody who acts exactly like a normal person, like you or I would, but they don't actually have any conscious experience.
Yeah, well, under the theistic model, I'm not sure how that could even be possible, because I mean, God could do anything, I guess. So I guess it's possible. But if someone is walking around and they have a body and they're acting exactly like any other human, I don't see any reason to believe that they wouldn't have a soul. But if they're acting like a zombie in that case, then maybe we could say that they're a body without a soul, or, I don't know.
All right. David, another question for you. Not sure what you're going to think of this one. It's from Scientific Origins. Some people think you could communicate with souls via seance or a Ouija board. Are you one of those, Dave?
I don't know that I am a person who thinks that can actually happen on the regular. It's something I think, given my Christian beliefs, I have to be open to that possibility that maybe that could happen. You have this really weird example, and I think it's the book of 1 Samuel, maybe 2 Samuel, where King Saul seems to like have some kind of communication with the prophet Samuel after he's died. So maybe God is just doing like a funny thing there, and so it's like a one-time exception, but plausibly that would give some credence to the idea that you could have communications from the dead. So I say it's something given my beliefs I have to be open to, but it's not something that like I positively think is going on a regular basis.
I do actually have a Ouija board in my closet. I could grab it and we could try it out and test it right here now if you guys want. But I'm planning on busting it out one of these days and making a video demonstration about Ouija boards and trying to see if they do work or not.
Save it for Halloween, my man. I would like make that a Halloween spooktacular on your channel.
Yeah, I think that's a good Halloween stream.
Yeah, my only fear is that it might not actually be that long of a video, because once I open up the Ouija board and see that it doesn't move, then what else are you gonna do?
Bring on multiple people. Bring on guests. Like bring Matt Dillahunty on and have him like try to do it and stuff. I mean, just make it an event.
It's a good idea.
All right. Another question for Dave. In your view, what is the second? Oh, sorry. This is from Sapir. In your view, what is the second best explanation for reports of out-of-body experiences?
Second best?
I'm assuming he thinks the best one is we've got souls and your soul's leaving your body.
No, I think that's actually probably the second best explanation. I think the best explanation is just that people, like, when you are in like a near-death experience and like you've got wonky stuff going on, and like your perceptions are probably just also getting screwed with. I actually tend to be pretty skeptical of the veridicality of reports of out-of-body experiences. I know a lot of dualists are like really fond of them, and I admit like I haven't gone down a really deep rabbit hole in this issue, But just sort of like prima facie on their face, I find most reports of out-of-body experiences as like veridical experiences to be incredibly like tenuous and suspect. And so I think that people are probably just, you're not getting enough oxygen or blood to the brain or whatever. And so your perceptions get kind of wonky. I think that's the best explanation. The second best is probably that people are just actually immaterial souls and can sort of kind of become detached from the body a little bit in these cases.
Yeah, I think this is a point where Dave and I agree on the best explanation for out-of-body experiences. And they've done tests where, say, somebody's on a hospital bed and they put a note up on a really high shelf. And then once they wake up, they say, "Did you read what the note said?" And they're like, "What note?" So obviously they think that they're having an out-of-body experience. They think they're floating above their bed, but there's no reason to think that they actually are. And a lot of times brains that are on the brink of death, once they come back, the brain fabricates memories to fill in the gaps because your brain doesn't like to have blank space. So the brain is just going to create what it anticipated would have happened in that time. And a lot of times these near-death experiences where someone claims they went to heaven or hell, they're almost always based on, I think they may entirely always be based on religions that people either belong to or grow up around or at least are familiar with. So you're not going to have somebody having a near-death experience for a religion that they've never heard of, that is believed by somebody else if they've never been introduced to this religion whatsoever. So presumably, if Christianity is the one true religion and these out-of-body experiences are real, then somebody who has never been showcased, they've never been exposed to Christianity in any way whatsoever, would still have a very Christian out-of-body experience, but we don't see that. Additionally, I'd also like to pinpoint that if somebody's soul is floating above their body and seeing things, that means they have to have some kind of eyes. Do they have ghost eyes? How are they perceiving the world around them if they don't have sensory organs or a brain to perceive that information?
I'm not sure either of those things are necessary since, obviously, in the case of like dreams, for example, you can have sensory perceptions in the absence of like corresponding visual stimuli. I guess you could still try to argue that that's generated by like experiences you have had or whatever. But point being, it's just not a simple case of like, if you don't have your, sensory organs in operation, then you can't perceive things. And as to the question of whether non-Christians have sort of like Christian near-death experiences, I have read that there's like this figure of light or something that is like supposed to appear, and that some people, even from like non-Christian traditions, claim to have seen. Some people think that that's Jesus, but I'm a little skeptical there as well because he tends to tell them pretty heretical things. But all that just to say, I'm not sure it's like as straightforward as Jed is saying, but ultimately, yeah, I still am pretty skeptical of the veridicality of out-of-body experiences.
I think the light figure is actually Zeus that they're seeing. So everyone is seeing Zeus, and then the Greek mythology is actually the true religion. But with regards to like the ghost eyes I was mentioning, and you brought up dreams, during a dream, your actual body may still be taking in some sensory input. So sometime if you fall asleep with a TV on, your brain kind of reinterprets what it hears on the TV as part of your dream. But in that case, you're using your body's actual sensory organs and reinterpreting them in a different way. If you have a out-of-body experience where you're floating above your body or you can see your own body, that entails that you're no longer using your body's sensory organs, because if you were, your eyes would be looking up at the ceiling and not down at yourself or floating above your bed, so that you have to have some kind of ghost eyes. And then, in a dream where you're, let's say you have some sort of completely radical dream, you mentioned that these visuals could be based on past experiences, which I think is, definitely part of it. But you could also have dreams that are completely fabricated by your own brain. And if you're going to claim that the out-of-body experience is a sensation of the actual world around you from a different perspective, then that necessitates that something besides your own brain is just fabricating completely made up information, but you're taking in real sensory data with something besides your own organs.
All right, well, we're pushing 3 hours, and I know Lance is trying to wrap up. So
Yeah, we've got 4 more questions, so we're going to try to get
Keep
through
them
them.
coming.
Yeah, there was one way back that I somehow skipped. I don't know why for Jed. So we're
Oh,
gonna get back
come
to that.
on,
Sorry
Lance.
about that,
Do
Chow
your
Knight.
job.
This is from Chow Knight, a question for Jed. What's your biggest struggle with Christianity? And what would it take for you to say, maybe the theists are onto something?
Well, my biggest struggle is that there's insufficient evidence to believe in the supernatural claims of it. So I see insufficient reason to think God exists. And if God is a bodiless mind, an immaterial mind, I see no reason to think that that's the case, because I see no reason to think that there's a mind behind the universe. I think that the whole notion of a God who created us and has a special plan for us, a lot of Christians may claim that, oh, I'm being really humble by worshiping God. But to me, it's the complete opposite. To me, it seems like the ultimate sense of ego, where, oh, isn't it a coincidence that the creator of the universe, who has a plan for your life, happens to be a man? It's a person. If you look up God on Google Images, they all look like people. They're just men. And I understand that Christians don't think God has a physical body and these are just artists' interpretations. But to whatever extent the body says that God the Father has a physical form, it seems to be very human-like, and God has very human-like characteristics, exactly the kind of thing we would expect humans to make up. And not only is there insufficient evidence to think that God exists, but I think that the moral claims made in the Bible are completely reprehensible. I think that the Bible at large, as taken as a whole, represents some of the worst attempts at morality that humanity has ever come up with. This idea that, and I know Dave doesn't subscribe to this idea, but the idea that I deserve to be tortured forever in hell by default, simply for not worshiping the guy who's threatening to torture me, is one of the most awful ideas I could possibly imagine. And the way that God in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, advocates that we behave, I think, is absolutely abhorrent and disgusting. And we can definitely save that for another discussion.
Yeah, I would just say I think that there absolutely is copious evidence for the truth of Christianity. I have a 6-hour video on my channel detailing the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. If people are curious for my extended case, I refer them to that. And of course, the issue with Old Testament violence is something that Christians have been, struggling with for thousands of years, because there's some tough stuff in the Old Testament. I detail my own approach to that in a video on my channel called "Making Sense of Old Testament Violence." The short overview is basically, I think it's incremental. It's an incremental step in sort of God improving the moral character of human beings over time, and so made certain accommodations and concessions for the particular culture of basically ancient Israel.
One last thing I'll mention about that is the inherent contradiction I see with what you just said and the notion I've also heard from Christians, where Adam and Eve were made perfect in the Garden of Eden, and over time, because of sin and mutations, the human race has devolved into a worse and worse form, where humans used to be perfect and now we're much worse and more corrupted by sin. So the notion that God would have to make bad rules on purpose and gradually make the rules better and better as human beings improve and elevate to a more heightened enlightenment or a better status, those two claims seem to be in contradiction with each other.
I'm not seeing what the contradiction is supposed to be, but I think we should probably move on.
Sure. Just to, put a bow on it quick. Humans used to be perfect and we're getting worse. God made really bad rules at start, and he's making better rules for us as we also get worse. But if humans used to be really good, why didn't God just make the good rules right from the beginning?
I don't see a P and not P there, but let's move on.
Yeah, we'll have to do another debate or something.
Sure.
So I did answer this in the chat because I know the answer, but I feel like it's worth addressing here. And it also gives both of you an opportunity to respond. So this question was directed at Dave. Is he a moral realist? Could he make a brief case if so?
I am not a moral realist. My sympathies lie very much towards moral anti-realism. In fact, I think that my theory of ethics is probably pretty consistent with like what the average Christian in the pew thinks. I'm just able to like couch it in more proper meta-ethical terminology. I think your average person in the pew probably does think that morality is just like basically stems from God's commands. And they don't like add all of this philosophical mumbo jumbo that like Christian philosophers nowadays add to it. So in that sense, I don't know that my view is actually all that different from the person in the pew, but I would just say I think I'm philosophically astute enough to know that that in no way qualifies as a form of moral realism. Now, it is technically compatible with moral realism because you could say that God's commands track stance-independent moral facts. But because I don't think that we have particularly good evidence for stance-independent moral facts in the first place, I don't see any reason to say that God's commands track those things. So I'm just kind of left as a moral skeptic.
Yeah, my position on morality is that I think when we talk about morals, what we're really talking about is the opinions of people about behavior. And I think that those opinions could have different criteria, and that criteria could be linked to something that's objective, but our willingness to take on that criteria as our foundation for morality is ultimately subjective. Like, for example, my morality is based on well-being and harm reduction. So I think it's moral to increase the well-being, health, and happiness of thinking creatures, and it's immoral to cause unnecessary pain and suffering. Now, there are certain actions which objectively cause pain and suffering. Like if I stab someone else in the throat, that's going to cause them pain and suffering. That's an objective fact of reality. But whether I care about their pain and suffering is a subjective opinion. There's nothing intrinsic in the universe that forces me or anyone else to care about suffering or pain reduction or well-being, other than the fact that it's been ingrained in most of our brains through the process of evolution because we're a social species. So we survived by working together, cooperating, and helping each other avoid pain and tackling problems as one cohesive unit. So evolutionarily, we've survived based on teamwork and cooperation. So those are values that most of us have. But again, there's nothing intrinsic in the universe. I don't think morality is a fact of the universe. And if you were to remove every human mind from existence, then I think morality would also cease to exist.
Are you clapping over there yet, Lance?
All right. We got two more questions. All right. This is a question for Jed from Cassius Khan. Question for Jed. Do you believe in anything that exists that is conceptual yet non-physical? If so, then if those things can be in the brain, wouldn't one part of the brain be not physical? I feel like it's very similar to a previous question.
Yeah, surely I can conceive of something that is not material. Like we talked about claims. Like, is a claim material? Not really. A claim could be about something material, but I don't know. I'm struggling to think of an example right now. Do I think, well, I don't know. Yeah, just on a basic level, yes, I can be convinced of claims and that those claims themselves are immaterial, but they exist as far as the brain state does in a physical way. So, the pathway in my brain represents the thought, and that thought exists as a neural pathway, but not as a thing unto itself.
I'll just say I don't think it makes any sense to actually speak of something immaterial literally being located in the brain, because immaterial things by definition lack spatiotemporal location. But maybe I'm reading the question really uncharitably.
All right. We are on to our last question. We'll wrap it up here. This is from Grant, who asks, this is for both of you. Could generative AI, large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, I think there's a missing word here. Let me start over. Could generative AI, large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude be P-zombies on your view?
I don't think that they would meet the technical, philosophical definition of the term as it's sort of presently understood, unless I'm missing something. But generally, I don't think that would meet the criteria of what people.
Yeah, we could imagine really advanced models of these AIs are instantiated in androids, and it's very hard to tell that they're not a human.
Yeah, maybe so. If you could somehow take a human body that's died, but keep it kind of alive, so there's no conscious experience, but then you AI it up, and maybe you could make actual P-zombies. That's interesting.
From a theistic perspective, if I put my theist hat on, if somebody were to create an android robot even from scratch and put an AI mind in it that's so advanced that we can't even distinguish whether it's real or not just by a first glance, I think that it's totally reasonable to say that that individual android has no soul because God hasn't granted it a soul. So maybe it could be a P-zombie. From my own perspective, I think that when we talk about AI, and it relies on hardware in order for its existence. So every AI, every software, every computer, no matter how advanced the AI or the artificial intelligence is, it's always relying on something physical for its existence. Software requires hardware. So these ChatGPTs, the AI, they all rely on a server somewhere else. I don't know where the server is, but none of them exist without something physical attached to them.
Okay. Thank both of you very much for being here. Thanks everybody in the chat for asking good questions. I really appreciate that it wasn't, we didn't get flooded with nonsense. I did filter a couple questions for various reasons. So if you didn't get your question asked, I'm sorry about that. And I might have missed a few. All right. So we are going to wrap it up there. I'm actually the one that's running out of steam. Probably it's all I wake up a lot with the baby. So I gotta try to get to sleep a little earlier. Okay, so we're gonna close it up there. I'll check in with both of you to say a little bit about where people could find your material and whatever it is. I did put a link to both of your channels in the description, but if you got websites, Substacks, whatever else it is you want to announce, feel free, and then that'll be it. We'll close it out there. Jed, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks so much for hosting, Lance. And thank you, Dave, for the opportunity for the debate. This was a lot of fun, cool topic. It forced me to do some research into some stuff that I'm not exuberantly familiar with. And, you know, the more I look into topics like this, the more it's become increasingly aware I have so much more to learn. And that's the case with everything. The more you learn that you need to learn. Thanks for linking my YouTube channel. I make a lot of, like I said, atheist content talking about skepticism, critical thinking, moral atrocities within religion. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok. My favorite platform is actually Instagram because on the shorts, you can put a thumbnail. So I feel like it's an extra little avenue for a little bit of extra creativity, and it's better organized, I think. So yeah, I like Instagram, but you can find most of my content on all three platforms: TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Dave, you also suggested I should change my name from the Flying Spaghetti Auditor. I actually did consider doing that recently, but the name I considered is even more of a meme than my current name. I was going to change it to Typical Reddit Atheist, because that's what I get accused of being all the time anyway. So I thought I might as well just embrace this name. But yeah, I don't want to use my legal name. So, you know, for now, I'll just stick with this, but who knows what the road will bring in the future. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
All right, Dave, you're up.
Well, look, I mean, I had somebody who said I could change my moniker to the Potty Mouth Apologist. So, you know, we always can go lower. But yes, people can find me at my YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason, kind of the polar opposite of what Jed is doing on his channel. I try to give a thoughtful, erudite, well-researched case for Christian theism. And I have a 9-hour series defending the existence of the soul. So if anything that I said here sounded remotely interesting to you, by all means, feel free to check out my long-form content defending the existence of the soul. With that being said, again, thank you, Jed, for agreeing to the debate at the last minute. And as always, Lance, thank you for having me on.
All right. And with that, we are going to close things out. So for everybody, I'll say something to the audience, which is, if you go check out their channels, do please subscribe to them. Check out the videos, like this video, do all the standard stuff you're supposed to do. I don't think the kinds of content any of us produce is particularly well received by YouTube. So we got to push ourselves up in the algorithm as much as we can. So do go over, like all the videos. It's one thing I always remind people: if you do go leave comments on other people's videos, don't contribute to this just awful toxicity of the comment sections I see in so many places, you know, where people just say nasty things and they're combative and they're belligerent. Don't do that. I especially don't want to send people over to either of your channels to have people go over there and be obnoxious. People are generally pretty nice here, and that's what I want to cultivate. And that's what we had in the chat. So that was good. I mean, when people get a little combative, I like that, but not when people are just obnoxious for the sake of it. Thank you both for being here. This is my first time doing this. And so I did have somebody say, is this going to become a debate channel? I don't think so. But I did want to do something a little different on the channel, and I hope it worked out well. I'd be happy to do something like this again. If both of you have a topic or you want to argue with other people, I'm happy to host. I'll do it again. And with that, I will see you all later. Take care, everybody.